The submissive male character in the romantic fantasy novel titled When the Saint Fell from Heaven, namely Duke Rosenta Estella, is described as a man of snowy character and beauty beyond that of a man. He is not often seen in the novel and never declared his feelings for the female characters. Among readers, he was recognized as a submale, and the girl, of course, thought the same until an accident took her life. A girl named Rose was asked to fetch a mug of beer, to which she readily agreed and asked to wait a moment. Another man sitting at a neighboring table asked Rosa to bring him a glass of water, after which the girl hurried to fulfill the order. Visitors in the institution discussed that Rosa lost her parents, but did not lose her vivacity. Children at her age run here and there and play games, but sometimes looking at Rosa, she seems to everyone an old lady who does not behave like a child. Only the truth was that Rosa remembered her past life, and she has the appearance of a child, but she is actually an adult. And the thing is, it's not a joke at all. The supervisor thanked Rosa for coming back to work today, then handed her some freshly baked bread as a treat. Rosa thanked the woman kindly, to which she replied that they were the ones who should be thanking her, and then wished Rosa a safe trip home. The girl remembered her past life, but she didn't expect anyone to believe it. To be more specific, the day her mom died of her illness, she was so emotionally drained that she lost consciousness. And when she woke up, she realized that in a past life, she had read about the world she was in now. Right now, every day of Rosa is filled with a lot of worries, so she absolutely does not want to interfere with the plot of the book. After arriving home, the girl collapsed on the table, as she had no energy left at all. Rosa decided that she would have an early dinner and go to bed. Suddenly, the girl woke up to the fact that someone wouldn't stop drumming on the door. Rosa got up from the table, wiping her drool from sleep, and went to open the door, assuming that a neighbor was standing there. But what was her surprise when she saw the man in front of her and the real guard beside him? The man asked Rosa if by any chance her mother's name was Jane Veronica. The girl answered in the affirmative and asked her interlocutor who he was. The man admitted that his lordship was looking for a young lady, namely his daughter. Rose had eyes full of surprise after hearing that Duke Estella was looking for her specifically. Later, upon arriving at the palace, Rosa stood before the Duke. The man was slightly upset as he expected it to be a boy. Rose wasn't too happy to be here either, after which she sarcastically apologized for the situation. The Duke asked the girl if she knew exactly who he was, and how dare she answer him like that. Rose bluntly said that the Duke was her father. The girl then asked the man what he was looking for her for. Suddenly, the Duke said that perhaps he should be grateful for the mistake he had made that night. After all, if he had not learned of his infertility, he would not have sought her out. The Duke decided that taking in a lousy half-breed would be far better than watching their family decline. Rose asked her father if she would really be living here. The Duke assumed that she would, since this was his last surviving offspring. Rose was slightly taken aback when she heard this, for she was pretty sure that the Duke had a son in the novel. Suddenly, the man told her that for many generations, men had been the heirs of their family, and his heir would also have to be a son. Therefore, the man informed Rosa that they had no choice but to make her a boy. The Duke gave the girl the name Rosenta Estella, and now she was to be Duke Estella's only son. Rose, after hearing this, was completely shocked and tried to put the puzzle together. After all, when she read the novel, she knew that Rosenta was a submale. But now it turned out that he was actually a woman. Rosa tried to explain that she was just an ordinary girl and didn't know how to play a guy. But the Duke insisted that if she was an ordinary girl, she wouldn't have cried or trembled at his intimidation, and besides, she wouldn't have immediately called him father. The Duke realized that discernment is a very good thing, but he wants Rosa to be considerate, for everything must have its time and place. A year later, Rosa was more or less used to her role, and even went around with a short haircut like a boy. She decided that she had to get up before Emma arrived. Rose looked at the ring and realized that it was too uncomfortable to wear it while she slept. Since Rosa was here, she could watch the characters in the novel, among other things. The girl asked the ring for her day to pass peacefully. Rosa decided to accept things as they are and enjoy the things that cannot be changed in any way. After all, when she becomes a duke, the world around her will become her own. Rose looked in the mirror and realized that she could not get used to how amazing she was. The girl used polymorphism magic, completely transforming her body. A little later, a maid named Emma entered the room and noticed that my lord had remembered to put on a magical artifact. The maid also added that they should do their best today to make my lord an even more worthy lord. Maid Emma reminded that she had repeatedly told my lord that one should not throw cutlery like this. Not only was it against etiquette, but as an honorable gentleman, he should not show his excitement. The woman also added that he had an audience scheduled with the emperor and would not be allowed to show emotion when meeting with him. Later during the conversation, the father said that when Rose sees the emperor and the crown prince, she should just smile as if she didn't know anything. The girl did not expect to see the crown prince, since he is the main male character in the novel. Rose was reminded by her father that she had been trained in manners for a year, so she had better remain unperturbed. The Duke once again reminded Rosa that she was no longer a commoner, but Duke Estella. Rosa promised her father that she would try not to make any mistakes. The girl remembered that he was 5 years older than that witch Vivian, who was the same age as Rosa. Rose assumed that meant he must be about 15. Still, the girl was excited that she would soon meet the protagonist. Later in the Emperor's palace, the blonde-haired man turned to the Duke and said that they looked a lot alike with his son. The Duke thanked the Emperor and said that for a child, he was quite collected, because usually children can't keep still. Still, the Emperor realized that it would be too tiring for him to be present at their conversations, so another place was prepared for him. Rosa left the room and thought about the fact that the protagonist and the witch frightened her a bit. What was Rosa's surprise when she saw the sobbing girl in front of her? Due to her tears, she couldn't see where she was running, causing her to push Rosa, and they fell to the floor together. Rose, in order to diffuse the awkward situation, asked my lady if she was all right, to which the girl gave a negative answer and continued to wipe her tears. My lady asked Rose if she had seen the crown prince. Rosa replied by explaining that she had just arrived. The girl could not calm down, for the crown prince appeared to be very wicked. He took to running away as soon as he saw her. Rose noticed that snot was flowing from my lady's nose, and then she held out her napkin. The girl immediately wiped the tears and snot and then hurried out of sight. Rose laughed a great deal. The girl entered the room and noticed that this room is clearly for children of her age. She decided to visit the balcony and enjoy the fresh air. Suddenly, a voice came from behind, saying that he liked to look at the garden here too, because its view was the most beautiful. Rose was taken aback when she saw His Highness in front of her. The girl knew that he was called Veteran until he met the protagonist, but you couldn't tell he was a bad person. The boy climbed down from the tree and jumped right onto the balcony where Rose was standing. His Highness approached the Duke's son and noticed that they looked very similar, except that his hair was not so thick. Rose couldn't help but agree, because that's what everyone says. His Highness was pleased that they only looked alike in appearance. His Highness said that he liked the Duke's son and asked if he could give him some advice. He then said that it was in his best interest not to get involved with the my lady he had met earlier. Rosa asked why, whereupon His Highness explained that the girl was a leech and would follow him every step of the way, for she did not care if you could not stand her, she would stick. His Highness said that it was time for him to go and advised the Duke's son to heed his advice, after which he jumped off the balcony. After a while, Rose noticed that the maid had managed to catch Vivian. The girl looked around and decided to read a book. After reading a couple pages, Rosa noticed Vivian coming towards her, holding one of the books in her hands as well. Due to the fact that Vivian was constantly peeping at Rosa, it was very difficult for her to concentrate on the plot of the novel. After that, she decided to ask the girl directly if there was anything she wanted to tell her. Vivian embarrassedly told her that the Duke's son's handkerchief got dirty, so she wanted to buy him a new one later. Rose said that it was not at all necessary, but Vivian began to insist, for she had plenty of money. The girl offered to buy 10 or even 200 instead of one handkerchief. Rose felt uncomfortable, but continued to refuse the request. After that, Vivian still gave in. Suddenly, the girl broke away from her seat and ran to the dressing table and began to arrange her tangled hair. Rose noticed that her curls were quite difficult to comb. Then she decided to take the initiative and asked my lady if she would mind if Rosa combed her hair. Vivian embarrassedly agreed, after which Rose asked my lady how to braid her hair. But that wasn't really important to Vivian, so she replied that she was leaving the choice to him. Suddenly, the girl noticed that all this time His Highness was watching them. After a while, Duke Estella said goodbye to the Emperor, saying that it was time for them to go. But noticing that his son Rosenta was standing still, he wondered why he wasn't going. Suddenly, Vivian jumped into Rosenta, thus surprising everyone around him. The father asked his daughter to let go of the Duke, to which the girl refused and clung even tighter to Rosenta's jacket, saying that she wanted to play with him more often. The father refused his daughter, but in return offered to buy her anything she wanted, so he suggested she go play with those toys. But Vivian didn't want them at all. Rosa noticed that her father was also uncomfortable, as the situation was very embarrassing due to the fact that there was no way to negotiate with Vivian. Rosenta then decided to step back and turn to my lady to explain to her that his back was hurting from how much she was pulling on his clothes. Vivian immediately apologized to Rosenta for making him uncomfortable, after which she immediately let the young man go. The father, who took advantage of the situation, immediately rushed to encompass his daughter to prevent her from clawing at Rosenta anew. The Emperor turned to his son Theodore to inquire what he thought of Duke Estella. The latter replied that he had noticed that the Duke was very calm, like a placid lake, and showed no angry impulses. Theodore did not understand how such a child could have been born to so angry a man. Still, he thought it was even more interesting that way. Upon arriving home, his father addressed Rosenta, saying that since their trip had gone well, he would reward him as he should, and from now on he could go outside accompanied by Heron. Rosenta thanked his father, assuming that Heron was one of the Duke's guards. Suddenly, his father added that he would start teaching him the same things that a member of the Estella family is supposed to know, for it had been a year already, so the time was right. Including the Helios Empire, the 4 duchies possessed certain abilities passed down from generation to generation. In the book, not much was said about the Estella family's abilities, all from the fact that unlike the power to cure the heroine and the saint, their power lay in the curse. Rose really hoped that, just as the book said, the ability would be passed on to her. The girl considered it a real relief that the story was unfolding according to the narrative plot. Even though her father had said that classes would begin soon, none had been held yet. And since Rosa got out for a walk with Heron, now it is her thoughts of enjoying the moment that occupy her most. After a while, Heron's guard informed my lord that they had finally arrived at the manor near where Rosenta's ballroom dancing lessons were held. Whereupon, upon entering the premises, my lord was immediately greeted by a lovely lady. Rosenta turned to the Baroness and said that she was lovely as always. The Baroness thanked her for her flattering words, telling my lord that he looked charming as well. Rosenta pointed out that it was more crowded than usual today. The Baroness explained that it was because they had a special guest. The Baroness added that she couldn't be his only dance partner, and besides, my lord would be meeting a lady his own age tonight. Rosenta was slightly taken aback when he heard this, but he was even more surprised when he saw that none other than Vivian had entered the hall. This girl was delighted when she saw my lord in front of her. After a while, the Baroness decided to conclude that this was the end of their lessons. The woman remarked that they had both done an excellent job and informed them that they would see each other next time. Heron handed my lord a glass of water. Rosenta began to slowly realize why the Crown Prince had called this girl a leech. He then turned to my lady, informing her that he wanted to ask her something. Rosenta wanted to know if she was here by chance, whereupon the girl embarrassedly admitted that it was unplanned, as she often takes lessons from Baroness Ferrora. Rosenta confessed that he was convinced that the Baroness only gave private lessons to him. He also added that what he valued most in people was honesty. At that very second, Vivian cracked up and confessed that she had come here for my lord. She said that she just wanted to get closer to him, because that time when he brushed her hair, he didn't curse her or tell her he hated her like the other girls did. And besides, Vivian was fascinated by Rosenta because he's handsome. Rosenta laughed, after which he recognized that this was a truly unexpected answer. He didn't know what to make of it, for Vivian had turned out to be too nice. Except that Rosa remembered that things were different in the novel. Rosenta turned to his lady, asking if she would be willing to tell him what she thought of the Crown Prince. Vivian admitted that she liked him, but if Rosenta also liked him, she would try to hate him. Rosa was not surprised to hear that the Crown Prince liked Vivian. whereupon she assured the girl that there was nothing strange about her feelings for him. Rosenta asked the mistress if she would be pleased if someone followed her everywhere. The girl decided that if she changed Vivian's habits, it wouldn't affect the story in any particular way. Afterward, Rosenta thanked Vivian for answering honestly, and then asked my lady if she would mind making an appointment with him in advance next time. Rosenta held out his palm to Vivian and asked the girl if she would like to be his friend. Tears of joy came to her eyes, and then she responded by extending her palm in agreement. Rosa did not know which of her words touched Vivian's heart, but the most important thing was that she took her hand and became her first friend in the world. Rosenta, upon arriving at the greenhouse of Estella Manor, ran into his father. The man informed his son that he would pass on the Estella family legacy to him. Rose learned that the ancestor of their clan was a necromancer. He had the gift of cursing. This ability was passed down from generation to generation. The father told his son that he could use some of his heritage. The man assured him that it was quite simple, for the power of the world would give his words power. Except Rosenta wasn't too sure what it all meant. Then his father touched the rose and told it to wither. The leaves lost their color and the bud bent in half. The father explained to his son that the effect depended on the intensity of the effort. The man decided that they would develop this ability little by little and start with flowers. Rosa tried to remember how her father did it and repeat after him. The girl noticed that her father didn't say anything out loud, but in her mind she heard him. Rosenta ordered the flower to wither as blood began to ooze from behind her mouth, staining the snow-white petals red. In the end, the girl was carried away on her back by the butler. The father only watched the whole scene unhappily. The man decided that most likely it was because he had the blood of a commoner in him, which was why he would not be able to inherit their gift. After which, he ordered the maids to clean the place up. Later in his office, the Duke argued that his son was not lacking in abilities, but they were beyond his comprehension. A smirk lit up the man's face at the thought. The father's goal was to teach his son how to control his power. The next day, Rosenta woke up with a scream. The maid standing beside him was overjoyed that my lord had finally woken up, then told him that the Duke had sent him magical artifacts. The artifacts had made it easier for Rosenta to control his powers over time. He even found a new use for them, and thankfully, he was no longer vomiting blood. Rosenta supposed that maybe it was because he was getting better at everything, that learning was becoming more fun and entertaining. But that didn't mean he was bogged down in studying, because today was the long-awaited day of the walk. Rosenta couldn't get enough of the beautiful fresh air. Rosenta was glad that his escort, Heron, had come quickly when he suddenly noticed a child wearing a wolf mask standing behind the man's back, whereupon my lord inquired of Heron who it was with him. Rosenta assumed that there was some magic involved, for he could see nothing in the eye slit. Heron admitted that he had brought along his apprentice, whom he had only recently taken in. Rosenta inquired of the attendant if he would be going along with them. Heron apologized to my lord, explaining that something had come up and he would not be able to be his chaperone today. However, he had obtained permission for my lord to walk within the palace walls, but Rosenta chose the option to go along with this child. The children walked around the city, enjoying each other's company. Rosenta didn't understand why this child was constantly keeping his distance. He then asked him to come closer, because they could walk together. In the end, the child moved only a step away. Rosenta asked the child what his name was, but all he heard in response was silence. Rosenta then assumed that he could not reveal his name for sure, since he was the apprentice of the assassin. But at the same time, he could not address him as you. Rosenta decided that they needed to call each other by their first names anyway to look like friends. So he decided that the best option would be to use temporary names. To begin with, Rosenta decided to ask the child what gender he was, after which it became clear that his new friend was a boy. Rosenta decided to call him Enoch. Upon entering the establishment, Rosenta addressed Enoch. The boy was surprised each time, for the name took him by surprise. Rosenta realized that after this answer, choosing food became even more difficult. But still, Rosenta voiced his order, which consisted of 3 steaks and 2 drinks. The girl serving them was slightly shocked when she heard that. Rosenta informed Enoch that those 2 portions were for him because kids his age needed to eat well, otherwise he wouldn't be able to defend himself with such skinny arms. and so Rosenta would have to protect him. But Enoch insisted that he could protect my lord. Rosenta agreed and decided to believe it this time. Today's walk was calm and peaceful, and even back home, Rosenta was reminded of Enoch. Henceforth, however, they never saw him again. One day he was curious, and so he decided to ask Heron about Enoch. The man explained that the child was too gifted to be trained by him, and so he sent him to a better teacher. Soon the memories of Enoch began to fade away. Rosenta was pacing around the palace when suddenly someone called out to him. It was a maid who reminded my lord that he had forgotten his handkerchief. She also added that he should always carry at least one with him, except that Rosenta had done it on purpose. Rosenta reflected on the fact that no matter how many he used, they still wouldn't run out. It was these very luxurious handkerchiefs that Vivian had tried her best to send him, and how the appointment was set. Vivian joyfully flew into the room to meet Rosenta as soon as possible. The girl fluttered directly into my lord's arms, thus greatly surprising him. Rosenta asked Vivian why she was always jumping into his arms, for he had said it was unsafe and she might fall. Vivian informed him that they would have a guest, namely His Highness the Crown Prince. His Highness turned to Duke Estella and said that he was looking forward to seeing them. The teenagers were peacefully sipping their tea when suddenly Rosenta noticed that the atmosphere had become a little strange. Vivian wanted to take a sip, but burned her tongue, after which the cup here fell to the floor. Tears immediately rolled down in the girl's eyes. Rosenta immediately began to calm Vivian, assuring her that everything was fine. The main thing was that she had not hurt herself. But as soon as the girl noticed that her hand was reddened from the burn, the girl howled even harder and clung to Rosenta. His Highness the Crown Prince was still drinking tea unemotionally at this time. At the same second, a maid rushed into the room. Rosenta hurriedly informed the girl that the tea had gotten on my lady's palm, and so it was necessary to immediately take her to her room and give her first aid. My lord also added that a cup had also broken. The maid apologized to the gentleman and said that she needed a moment to clean the place up. Rosenta was reassuring Vivian when he suddenly noticed that His Highness the Crown Prince was watching him intently. Rosenta realized that he had completely forgotten about His Highness's presence, so he treated Vivian as usual. The maid returned after a couple of minutes and suggested that my lady first administer first aid, and the other gentlemen were asked to go to another room, after which she asked them to bow out. As a result, His Highness the Crown Prince and Duke Estella were left alone. The Crown Prince sat down on the sofa and asked Rosenta if he was being too nice to Vivian, because he was doing himself a disservice. Rosenta studied His Highness and noticed that he had a look on his face that he was now beginning to understand Vivian's feelings, and was sure that he would become even more elegant and attractive when he grew older. His Highness told Rosenta that he was a very entertaining kid. He advised him to avoid that leech at all costs, and he ended up taming it. After which he inquired how the Duke had managed to do so. Rosenta was slightly annoyed when he heard that he was called a boy, even though he realized that he was younger than Theodore. Rosenta explained that he didn't understand how one could tame a friend. After all, they were just getting close, except that His Highness wasn't sure about that, as he realized that Vivian would hardly have come to him to apologize just because they had become friends. The Crown Prince walked over to Rosenta and whispered in his ear that Vivian had told him not too long ago that it must be hard to socialize with someone who was pursuing him against his will, after which she apologized. She had also asked him to be her friend. Rosenta realized that it must have happened after they became friends because he nagged her and told her to make more friends. Eventually, Vivian just ran out and repeated everything she had said to Theodore. Rosenta asked the Crown Prince if he had accepted her offer. His Highness said that at first he wanted to know what had led her to that decision, as it appeared that she was simply looking for a different approach to him. Rosenta reflected that if the Crown Prince and Vivian became friends, then the protagonist of the novel would find the changed witch protagonist attractive and fall in love with her. After that, Rosenta asked His Highness if he was beginning to like Vivian, except that His Highness's reaction to those words spoke for itself. The new relationship between them had been building for several years. For some strange reason, every time he promised Vivian, Theodore was at her place. When Rosenta would sometimes go with his father to the palace, and Vivian would somehow show up there. Gradually, the three of them began to spend more and more time together. At first, Rosenta was rather concerned that they would get married before the story in the book began, and that would be the end of it. Theodore asked Vivian if she was still asking Rosenta to braid her hair. Except Vivian didn't understand why Theodore cared at all. Rosenta, who was sitting next to her, was just begging for them to get married, because they would all be very lucky if they didn't become mortal enemies. On the other hand, Rosenta thought about how that would only be possible if they had originally stayed apart. Rosenta asked his friends to stop bickering and admonished Vivian to watch how to address His Highness. Theodore reminded everyone that Vivian had once cried and asked him with a sad look to be her friend. The girl became very angry that Theodore was starting to remind her of that again. Vivian jumped up and slapped her hands on the table, explaining that she was very blind back then. Rosenta lost his temper as well, wishing his friends would enjoy their bickering and he would perhaps excommunicate himself. Vivian begged Rosenta not to leave, after which she blamed Theodore for everything. Rosenta lay back on the table and thought about how everything that had happened recently seemed like one long, happy day. He had made his high society debut with Vivian as his partner and spent almost every weekend with his friends. Rosenta stood up and explained to his friends that he was happy. Too happy not to start worrying, because judging by the plot of the book, what happens next is not going to be something pleasant. In the Helios Empire, in the 45th year of Alexander's reign, 2 stars fell from the sky. When the first fell, Duke Estella was caught in an avalanche on her way to the temple. Shortly afterward, the second great star fell, and the emperor fell asleep and fell into a deep sleep from which he could not awaken. Everything happened suddenly, and someone suspected an assassin in what had happened, but no trace was found to confirm it. With the setting of one sun over the Helios Empire, it was time for the next to set. And so began the millennial history of Helios in the first year of Theodore's reign. The aristocrats were discussing around the table that it would take some time to accept him into the circle of their clan members. Besides, perhaps he should be trained, for the young man lacked experience. Besides, no one had expected Duke Estella's demise so soon. It was wrong for his son to inherit the title, but he was too young after all. He was only 20. The man wasn't going to bring it up, but he decided to say that for many generations, the Estella family had been an honorable family of nobles, and only respected aristocrats were in it. And now, the blood of a commoner was among them. Another nobleman said that he also wanted to celebrate this because a duke with dirty blood could hardly stand on the throne. So the aristocrats decided that he could still work on himself, and in the meantime, perhaps one of their children will take care of it. Eventually, a fight broke out between the nobles over someone's family being next, after the duke's family. It was eventually explained to him that he was close to the dukes of earlier generations, as the penultimate duke was a member of his family. Eventually, one of the men suggested asking my lord directly, whereupon came a question addressed to Rosenta as to whom he would like to see as steward of the family. But in response, Rosenta told everyone to shut up. Rosenta was convinced that they were right in that he had just become an adult and his mother was a commoner. But he didn't understand how these aristocrats could think that his ties with the Estella family weren't the strongest. Rosenta added that they say heirs from the sidelines can barely leave one flower in 5 as their connection to the family is weak, and was curious how such a person could replace him, after which he told them to get out. Rosenta turned to the aristocrats and said that his father was ruthless to subordinates who disturbed his peace. But he wasn't like that, and as long as they were on his side, he would gladly turn a blind eye to their first provocation. Rosenta asked the nobles directly if they would be his allies or foes. In the first year of Theodore's reign, there was a memorial service for the late emperor. Rosenta wished him to rest in peace. Rosenta noticed a girl and asked her where His Highness the Crown Prince was. The noblewoman admitted that she had seen him leaving here a little earlier. Rosenta walked around looking for Theodore and eventually came across him in such a familiar place. Afterward, he turned to His Highness and inquired if he was all right. Rosenta placed an umbrella over his head. Theodore admitted that he hadn't been asked about it yet, because everyone was busy chattering about his father. That was why no one had inquired about his condition. Rosenta threw back his umbrella and admitted that Vivian had often cried in his arms when she was younger, but he did not recall giving Theodore the opportunity to do so. His Highness the Crown Prince laughed and asked his friend if he wanted him to cry to him like Vivian had. Rosenta moved closer and hugged his friend, telling him that there was no need to cry, he only wanted to comfort His Highness. In response, Theodore hugged Rosenta and thanked him. Suddenly, Vivian crept up from behind. The girl also had tears in her eyes, after which she picked up an umbrella from the ground and covered her friends from the rain. That afternoon, a crying Vivian sheltered them under the umbrella. Sometime later, in some tavern, people were discussing among themselves that there were 3 of the most beautiful people in the Helios Empire, and one of them was Duke Estella. One of the men commented that if he was so handsome, it was worth checking out what he had down there. Rosenta, who had heard the conversation, flew over to the man and pressed his face against the table. The patrons inside the tavern immediately ran for the exit so they wouldn't get it too. The man knelt down and begged for mercy, explaining that he had a wife and a son named Enoch, and so someone should take care of their sustenance. Rosenta ended up killing the man, but was glad that he had not heard that name in a long time. After that, they never found time to meet. Theodore took the throne, and Rosenta had to make sure his father's palace went to him. And Vivian was so immersed in high society that she barely had time to rest. Occasionally, they sent each other letters, but no longer being children, it became difficult for them to meet every time they wanted to. And the number of duties to fulfill grew. Rosenta stretched, reminding himself that little by little they were finishing sorting things out. A maid standing in the room noticed that her master was awake. Anna was Rosenta's personal maid, and also Emma's granddaughter. The maid noticed that her master was dressed in women's clothing and said that she didn't mind the sight, but didn't understand if it was okay to be unprotected like that. Rosenta explained that there was nothing wrong with being unprotected, that it was about having a bad dream. The maid handed the lord his artifacts and then put each of them on. Rosenta thought about the fact that the number of artifacts had increased over the past few years, after which, in a flash, Rosenta became a man and asked Anna to prepare to leave for the palace. On the way, Rosenta thought that one could only guess why, among the 4 clans, only the Estella family didn't have their own land. After all, they had settled on the outskirts of the capital, but had been near the palace for hundreds of years. And since he was now the new head, it was necessary to observe the formalities and visit the emperor to make sure their relationship continued on a good note. Rosenta found Theodore behind a pile of papers and with huge black eyes. Rosenta noticed that it had been a very long time since they had seen each other. Theodore held his head up and explained that it was full of documents he had never seen before, and even looked at the letters addressed to his father. Theodore realized that at this rate, a grave of stacks of papers would soon greet him. Rosenta asked His Highness if he needed any help. Theodore immediately perked up when he heard this, also noting that his friend's attentiveness was commendable, and therefore he would not refuse his help, then asked the maid to bring the Duke a table and chair. Rosenta realized at that very second that he had merely been courteous and had set himself up. Still, there was no choice, so he decided that he would help an old friend, after which he wondered where he should start. Rosenta decided to stretch his back for a second and distract himself from his work, as he suddenly heard a woman's voice. And at that very second, Vivian entered the room. The girl immediately threw off her cap and shoes and plopped down on the couch. She asked her friends why they had not told her they would be here. Vivian said that while she was shopping, she was told that the Estella family carriage had pulled into the palace. Theodore joked that he didn't even know Vivian had such warm feelings for him. The girl immediately explained that she had not come here for him, but to see Rosenta. Rosenta, watching his friends squabble, realized that it had been a month, but nothing had changed, but still he missed it. He then suggested that they go together as soon as they were done with everything here. Suddenly, Rosenta came across a paper and thought that if he stuck to the plot of the book, then he wouldn't be able to solve this problem and it would end up badly. After all, this letter alerts the beginning of the course of the plot of the novel, where Vivian will become a witch who constantly haunts Theodore. As a result, Theodore will become irritable. Not to mention that he will spend the rest of his life in recluse after the death of the emperor. His character will deteriorate, while cruelty takes root in his heart. When he steps away from managing the affairs of state, the empire will wallow in ruins. And to solve the problem, the protagonist saint will appear before him. Rosenta realized that this was true, because the saint might appear to the irritable Theodore, but now he was not irritable. He was still the same old cunning man. Vivian and Theodore watched their friend, deciding that something was obviously wrong with him. Vivian found it odd how frighteningly beautiful he was. She remembered that it was always like that, and assumed it was because of the luxurious shirt she had given him, because he was shining more than usual. Rosenta laughed in response and wondered what it was they were discussing. Theodore was incredibly happy that his friend was finally relaxing. After all, he had a very serious expression on his face and had moved his eyebrows from the tension, but now he looked much better. Rosenta put aside his thoughts about the progress of the plot of the novel. After all, what did it matter what happened in the original? After all, he didn't care about it anymore. Then he asked His Majesty to read the letter. The letter said that a man had lived in Charity Town all his life, and for a week now a sandstorm had made their existence here unbearable. Theodore remembered that this city was close to the desert, but there was a distance between them. His Highness had never heard of such a thing happening in his father's lifetime. Rosenta said that he recently read about it in a book, and added that the Great Sandstorm appears every 200 years in the city of Tarion, which is close to Charity. Rosenta had also heard that the storm is so big that it swallows everything in its path. Also, it is huge enough to reach the center of the empire. Theodore was angry because the letter was taking a long time to arrive, and by the time they would wait for a reply, it would be too late. Vivian asked her friends for a moment of attention because she had something to say. The girl listened to their conversation and told them that she thought she knew how to get to Tarion. Vivian added that she had recently received an invitation from the Grey Clan, and she was sure they could escort her there. Rosenta, upon hearing this news, immediately jumped up and approached His Highness, informing him that he should go there with Vivian. The girl was overjoyed at this. Rosenta decided to go there with Vivian and spend time there together, while Theodore should continue to deal with the affairs of the palace. At this time in the palace, Estella the maid asked the Lord if he had to leave at this hour, to which she received a positive answer. Rosenta simply couldn't wait for the saint to appear, for the lives of many people were now at risk. Rosenta informed the maid that he would need some supplies. A brilliant mage with unique powers is on the run for killing his mentor. The Dark Knight, who appeared in the novel to stop a sandstorm, is what he needs. Rosenta arrived in the city and noticed an inn called Light in the Darkness. Rosenta assumed it was a place where the Dark Knights usually stayed. The terrible secret of the book called When the Holy One Fell from Heaven was that the mage who raised him since childhood had a rather inquisitive mind and often used his young, brilliant student in experiments. Because of all the torment he had endured, the boy's unstable mind was shattered. Eventually, after biding his time and becoming stronger, he killed his mentor and ran away. The mentor was a sage of the Magic Tower, so the mages put the Dark Knight on the wanted list. He stayed at the same inn until he met the protagonist and became known as the Lunatic of the Alley. Rosenta remembered that he would later try to take over the Magic Tower to win over the protagonist. But none of that scared him, because he wouldn't run away since he needed him right now. Rosenta was counting on this mage to go with him, even if it would take a fight to convince him to do so. Rosenta entered the inn, where he was immediately greeted by a friendly man with a mustache and asked how he could help. Rosenta informed him that he was looking for someone when suddenly there was some noise. The man working at the inn immediately turned around and said that he knew this would happen and told him not to make a bet with the wolf. Rosenta was surprised when he heard that, after which he immediately rushed over there, informing the innkeeper that he shouldn't go there. The dark-haired man pulled out a knife and slit the other man's throat. He was displeased, wondering why the man had even bothered to provoke him and make a bet in the first place. The man noticed the presence of someone else, then turned around and asked Rosenta if he wanted to bet with him too. Rosenta explained that he wanted to ask a favor. The Mad Mage approached Rosenta, informing him that for his information, he doesn't do anything that goes against his interests. But it looked like he had something entertaining to offer. The man sat down and informed him that his deposit for the job was 10 gold pieces. Rosenta placed the pouch of money on the table without a second thought. Afterward, he wondered if the man would even ask what needed to be done. The man explained that he hadn't even thought about it, after which he asked what was required of him. Rosenta realized that he had almost finished the man off, so that showed that he was willing to do a lot. Afterward, he explained to the wolf that he was hoping that he would deal with the sandstorm that was brewing in Tarion. Rosenta also added that it was difficult to get there, so he would join him disguised as an escort. Rosenta studied his interlocutor and realized that he had no identification, so it would be safer if he pretended to be a servant. Rosenta also decided that his assignment actually consisted of 2 requests, yet he didn't know at all what to do if the man refused, but Wolf happily agreed, saying that it sounded great. Rosenta then asked to be allowed to introduce himself, after which he gave his name, and added that he was the Duke of the Estella family. In response, Wolf said that he was clear. Rosenta was a bit surprised, for he expected the man to add something else. The man decided that he should also introduce himself, but Rosenta beat him to it, saying that he already knew that his name was Wolf, and said that he was looking forward to their cooperation. Wolf moved even closer and informed him that he too was looking forward to their cooperation. He ended up being the butler, whose uniform was far cooler than the attendant's clothes. The man asked him to call him Butler Wolf. Vivian could barely walk anymore. This was exactly why she didn't want to go to Tarion. The butler offered the girl a drink of water, a supply of which he had prepared in advance. Vivian took a sip and asked the wolf if he was tired. The man explained that he was having a hard time, but he was having fun. Vivian noticed that this was Wolf's first time in this position, yet he was doing well. Rosenta, looking at the whole picture, realized that he was worried about his impulsiveness for nothing, but surprisingly, Wolf appeared very calm. Upon arrival, they were greeted by a lovely young woman, informing them that they would be staying here and she would escort their servant to their chambers. Vivian turned to her friend, informing her that she needed to fix her hair and wondered if she should come to him or if he would come to her. Rosenta informed his friend that he would come to her soon. Rosenta now realized why the 3 of them had a ridiculous love triangle gossip spread. But that didn't matter to him at all. Out of nowhere, Butler Wolf crept up and announced that the banquet was about to begin, so they should hurry to get ready. The blonde-haired man explained that it was nothing special, but he hoped they would enjoy it. Rosenta, watching Duke Gray, realized that it would be rather difficult to approach him, and since that was the case, they should make him approach them himself. After a while, Rosenta turned to Vivian to inquire if she would dignify him with a dance with her. The girl laughed, but still accepted the invitation, saying she was truly honored. During the dance, Rosenta noticed that they moved harmoniously because they had been practicing together since childhood, and as expected, all eyes were on them. Eventually, Duke Estella's plan worked, and Duke Gray approached them. The man thanked Vivian and Rosenta for accepting his invitation. The girl explained that she should be the one to thank him for inviting them to such a wonderful place. Duke Gray remembered that the girl had refused to pay them a visit before. Rosenta, who was observing the whole scene, noticed that no one was noticing him. Eventually, he decided to enter the conversation himself and informed the Duke that he was glad to meet him, after which he introduced himself. They shook hands as the Duke said that he had heard that his family was electing a new head. The aristocrats were delighted to meet each other. Rosenta admitted that he had escorted My Lady Marigold because he had a message for the Duke. Gray was greatly surprised to hear these words, whereupon Rosenta suggested that he read it at once. After a couple of seconds, Gray was very much surprised and didn't understand how this could happen, because he would never have thought that such a thing would happen, except that Rosenta realized that Gray knew everything from the beginning, but he ignored it, because this problem wouldn't affect him much. Rosenta turned to Duke Gray and said that if it was all right with him, he would like to take a quick look at Tarion before leaving. After all, he was sure that the city had become more beautiful recently, so he hoped he could see it while he was here. Duke Gray agreed and said that they would be very happy to show them around. Rosenta was glad that he had given his permission, for if they took care of this problem, he would have less worries. At the end of the reception, Vivian and Rosenta said goodbye and agreed to see each other tomorrow. The Duke was suddenly called by the butler Wolf, who asked him to braid his hair. Rosenta was not very pleased with this request, as it was not something he should be doing, but he decided that it was better to just quietly fulfill his request. Butler Wolf sat down and informed him that he wanted the same hairstyle that the Duke had done so My Lady. After a while, the hairstyle was ready, whereupon the Duke informed the butler that he would now be grateful if he left. Rosenta, left alone, at once plumped himself on the sofa. He decided to wash his face, but at least get to the bed first. Suddenly, the butler entered the room, saying that Rosa hadn't changed at all and she was still the same. The girl was in her real form at this time and was sleeping peacefully, unaware of anything. Enoch asked Heron why everyone addressed my lady as a man. After this question, Heron apologized to the child and explained that he could not stay here any longer. After his encounter with the magic teacher, his mind was crippled and he felt nothing. But the strangest thing was that the dangers gave him strength. It was as if his nerve endings were sharpened, and he didn't feel any different from other people. He didn't realize what the emotion was, however, for his heart was racing for a reason, and the feeling was strange, but not bad. Enoch had said he was thrilled to be called Wolf, but the man didn't know how he would feel if she called him by his name. The man was going through his options on how to get her to say it. He really wanted Rosa to be able to recognize him. The next day, Rosenta felt awful, even though he had gotten a good night's sleep and had eaten all the food he wanted. But at the same time, he felt defeated for some reason. This didn't go unnoticed by his friend Vivian, who asked how he was doing, to which Rosenta assured him that he was fine. But Rosenta assumed that his condition was because he and Duke Gray had been walking along the sandstorm area since morning. Suddenly, there was a knock on the door, followed by a voice turning to the Lord and saying that everything was ready. Rosenta was glad that at last they would get down to business, for they must get to the source of the problem. Vivian turned to her friend and said that she had been tormented by curiosity since the morning about Wolf's hair. After preparing for the trip, Rosenta asked Wolf's butler why there were only 2 camels. The butler explained that they said they would only give them to Mr. and Mrs. Vivian. Rosenta was very unhappy with the way he was treated. However, there was no time to argue, but he couldn't leave Vivian here either. Suddenly, Wolf the butler approached the Lord, explaining that since he was the butler, they could go together and take a second camel. Wolf added that he was a servant, so it would be wrong to leave without the Lord while they looked for a camel or waited for the situation to be resolved. During the ride, Vivian couldn't even open her eyes because of the sand. The girl already regretted not listening to her friend and staying in the palace. At this time, Rosa was fast asleep, when suddenly the butler Wolf told her that he would not allow his employer to get hurt before he paid for his work, and then hugged her tightly. Rose looked around at the situation and thought it was strange, as not a grain of sand was flying at them, with a storm going on around them. Rosa asked the butler if it was his doing, to which she received a positive answer. The girl decided that it was even better, because this way they would not be seen because of the sand. If someone tells about the magical power of the wolf, the mages from the towers will come after him. At this time, Vivian was almost blown away by a gust of wind. The girl asked her friend what was going on. Rosenta asked Vivian to hold on and explained that he would stay here and deal with the storm and then come after her. Later, Rosa asked Wolf's butler when he'd started using magic. The man admitted that he had started to conjure after his employer had fallen asleep, because it would be strange if he suddenly blocked their visibility, so he had to gradually increase the intensity of the wind. Rosenta asked the butler if he had forgotten what their assignment was, for he wanted Wolf to deal with the tornado. The butler got off his camel and began to use the element of air and wind, after which he took out a wolf-shaped mask. Rose was immediately very surprised when she saw it, and then began to remember the long black as tar hair as well as the wolf mask. The girl assumed that Enoch was standing in front of her now. Rose still doubted if it was really Enoch, but she couldn't help but agree that his magic was very strong. Due to the wild gusts of wind, the girl couldn't lift her head and hoped it would all be over soon. Later, at Duke Gray's palace, a man met them and asked how they had traveled. The Duke noticed that the butler was lying on his camel with no strength at all, whereupon he began to feel sorry for him. Rose explained that he wasn't dead, just passed out. Duke Gray decided that this was a small relief. The Duke then inquired if they were going home already, for my lady looked tired, and perhaps that was why they should stay a couple days. Rose refused such an offer, explaining that it would be much more difficult if she stayed here, which was why she would like to return as soon as possible. The girl also got angry and explained that since they had gotten rid of the storm, they could at least lend them a griffin as a thank you. Vivian was well aware that Duke Gray was good at taming monsters. The Duke had tried to explain to my lady that it was a bit much. Rose remembered that Griffin was the name of a flying beast used for desert exploration and transportation supplies. Rose didn't understand how her friend Vivian could ask for such a precious thing as flying it, but still, it was her style. Thanks to such a character, the entire high society worships her. Vivian asked Duke Gray to take a look at their fortune. The girl admitted that she was surprised that she had gotten out of there alive at all, then asked the Duke how he could have sent them to such a place. The girl was sure that if the Duke knew what was there, he wouldn't have let them go there. The Duke didn't know what to do anymore, and offered my lady to take one griffin. But the girl refused, explaining that there were too many for one griffin and they should allocate at least 2. Eventually, Vivian got her way, and they got 2 griffins on which to part the air. Later, upon arriving at Duke Estella's palace, Rosa asked that Butler Wolf be assigned a private room, and she would escort Vivian home. The butler seemed to obey the order. In the carriage, Rosenta leaned the girl's head on his shoulder and said that he would wake her up when they reached, thus giving the girl a rest after the arduous journey. Emperor Theodore rules the Helios Empire. The safety of the world and the state is what the emperor must ensure first and foremost. However, other thoughts have been visiting Theodore lately. Theodore pondered the fact that his friends had traveled to Tarion a few days ago, but for some reason, no word had yet arrived. The man assumed that perhaps there had been a disaster, but he was sure that they would have let him know then if something had gone wrong. Suddenly, a butler entered the room, informing him that a letter had arrived from the Duke of Rosenta Estella. Theodore unfolded the paper and began to read the text, which stated that they had sorted out Tarion's problem without any problems and had already arrived home. Rosenta also admitted that he was very tired, so he would need a few days of rest. Theodore was glad that his friends had returned unharmed. His Highness then turned to Gilbert the butler and informed him that he wanted the healer to prepare a month's supply of medicine that was good for overwork, and he would take them to Lady Marigold and Duke Estella himself. Suddenly, Rose wanted to call out to Butler Wolf as she suddenly realized that she had gotten so used to his company in a couple of days that she was already unconsciously calling out. Whereupon she rang the bell, and a maid entered her room, inquiring if she had slept well, and also adding that she had prepared a warm bath for washing. Except that Rosa wondered how Wolf was doing. The maid replied that Wolf was sleeping for now, after which she inquired who the man was. Rosa realized that it was Enoch from the past, but she wasn't completely sure yet. The girl began to put on her artifacts, informing the maid that she would call her as soon as she was done. The girl thought about the fact that the main character named Han Yera would have to appear soon, a Korean university student of average height, the one who would be revered as a saint after traveling through the dimensions when she arrived here. Rose didn't want to see even the slightest suffering of Theodore, so she hired a dark mage to deal with the sandstorm. But if you stick to the plot of the story, Han Yora has to fall from the sky to resolve it. Many people liked that she is a determined, beautiful, and young girl who knows how to love. She was given the title of a saint. However, Rosa knew what would happen when she appeared. For then, Vivian and Vivian might be separated. Rosa thought about the fact that if she followed the storyline, they might become enemies because of the saint. Still, the girl decided that Vivian never harmed anyone for no reason, so she would probably take her side. However, in the novel, Rosenta was not involved in their relationship, so the girl decided that it was not worth distorting the course of the narrative for the sake of saving friendship. And to begin with, it was worth returning the wolf to where he belonged before Yora showed up. His presence would only add to Rosa's headaches. Still, the girl wondered if it was really Enoch. For then, it turns out that she had given him a name before the protagonist did. Rose realized that it was technically temporary, but it was still a mistake. The girl started thinking about what if he didn't react in any way when she gave him the name. So she decided that the best solution would be to ask him directly. Then she called the maid Anna and informed him that she needed to see the wolf. Rose realized that this was the moment when Wolf had not yet attacked the magic tower, and it would take him some time to regain his magical powers. The girl entered Wolf's room and made her way to his bed. Rose remembered that he would have to experience a side effect first, namely sleeping for a few days until his body got stronger. The girl stepped closer to the wolf and said that if she was not mistaken, he was Enoch. At that very second, the man opened his eyes and pulled Rose to him. The man asked Rosenta what she had just said, after which the girl repeated the name Enoch. The man admitted that he had been waiting for this for a very long time, so he asked her to repeat his name again. The girl was greatly surprised when she realized that the man in front of her was indeed Enoch himself, who also already thought it was his name. As Rosa suspected, he too had long ago fallen back from the line of narration, and now there was no turning back. At this time, Theodore entered the room and found his friend in a very strange position before grabbing his sword and presenting the wolf mount. His Highness was aggressive and asked the stranger who he was. Enoch only touched the sword and in response asked Theodore who he was. His Highness was surprised that he wasn't recognized. Rose entered the conversation and asked the wolf to stand up and turned to Theodore, asking him to put his sword away. Theodore ended up covering his friend with himself. Rosa tried to explain that this was his acquaintance and caution was unnecessary, but Theodore didn't want to leave it that easy, since this stranger had climbed on top of him. Rosenta assured his friend that they weren't fighting and he was safe. In any case, Rosenta decided that they had better end this meeting, because someone might misunderstand seeing three men in the same room, whereupon Rosa grabbed Theodore and dragged him to the living room to talk. Later in the living room, Rosa asked His Highness how he ended up in that room. His Highness admitted that he just wanted to see a friend. Theodore also added that he noticed that the last room after turning left was open, and he heard voices, and so he went to look and then saw a figure above Rosenta. The girl at this second realized that the fact that the door was open was her omission, whereupon she inquired of her friend if there was no one near him. His Highness admitted that he had gone to the storeroom, and he had gone to Rosenta's study as usual. The girl realized that even if the servants knew how to keep their mouths shut, it was worth one word to leave this palace. There was no escaping the gossip. That's why she was sure that everyone would talk about her fondness for men. And after that, it would get to the point where people would talk about having feelings for the emperor. That was why Rosa was very glad that they were not caught. The girl was also glad that they were caught by none other than her friend. Except that His Highness didn't really understand what Rosenta meant. So he explained that the other would have misunderstood everything and thought they were doing something strange. His Highness decided to change the subject and asked his friend who it was, since he hadn't met this person before. Rose explained that his name was Enoch, and he had recently helped her with her errands, though he had introduced him to Vivian as her butler. Rosa questioned whether to retell that Enoch was a mage. Enoch and Theodore had not met in the original, so His Highness would only find out afterward that Enoch was a mage, as the latter would show his powers when Yora was in danger. The girl realized that if she told, Theodore would contact the magic tower, and when he found out that Enoch was not registered there, they would have even more problems. So she said she had paid a fair price for his services, and she needed a helper to manage the sandstorm. Theodore asked his friend what the helper had ended up doing. Rosa realized that it wasn't his habit to ask, but for some reason, he was still so insistent. Rosenta added that he was using the magical artifacts she had brought with her, and then activating them while she held them. Theodore calmly accepted this information, but Rosa noticed that he seemed to want to ask something else. Rose finally informed His Highness that she was writing everything in detail in a report and would provide it to him. Theodore glowed after hearing this news. On the way back, the man thought about why this scene wouldn't get out of his head. Theodore remembered that everything turned cold inside, and he ended up pointing his sword at the man who was just Rosenta's assistant, and nothing more. Still, he remembered that the man had an unusual look in his eyes, as if he was ready to rush forward like wild animals on prey. Theodore remembered perfectly well that his friend had said it was nothing, but for some reason he felt disgusted. The man assumed that envy was taking over at the thought of losing his friend. A couple days later at the Imperial Palace, Rose was chatting with the butler. How many times he said that His Highness was dining and asked Rosenta to join him if he hadn't eaten yet. Rosa gladly agreed. After Enoch received his payment and left the palace without question, despite Rosa's assumption that it would be difficult to get him to leave, the goodbye was short. Rosa realized that it had been a long time since she had been to the palace and remembered that the report regarding the sandstorm and the invitation had to be turned in today. Although the girl realized that most of the reports were lies. Upon entering the dining room, Theodore immediately greeted his friend. Rosenta thanked His Highness for inviting him to dinner, since he didn't even give him any warning of his arrival. Theodore asked his friend about what they had recently talked about. Rose replied that she would show him, and then held out a couple of papers. Theodore scrutinized them carefully, and then asked Rosenta if he had any more reason to contact that dubious man. Rosenta asked His Highness if he was talking about Enoch. Rosa then answered in the affirmative, and added that he had completed the task she had hired him for, so there was no point in seeing him again. This was a real relief to Theodore, for his manners, looks, character, and everything about him is imbued with arrogance. Theodore actually despises Enoch. Afterward, he asked His Highness not to talk about him. Rosenta said that he was planning to hold a banquet in his palace, since he had become the head and had to organize the banquet. For nobles in new positions, these are quite common customs, akin to gestures of goodwill. To be honest, Rosa would rather not bother with such things and would rather it was cancelled altogether. But it seems that the process of preparation itself is much more tedious. Theodore noticed that compared to the others, his friend was a bit procrastinating, after which Rose held out an invitation to His Highness. The preparations were hectic. With no woman in the family, one had to take care of every little thing oneself, and she had to worry about them doubly since her position was at risk. On top of that, and on the day of the banquet, she had asked Vivian to double-check everything. Fortunately, she had approached the preparations with enthusiasm and meticulousness. They all worked so hard that by evening their strength had left them. After giving Vivi a treat and walking her home, Rose immediately headed towards her chambers, after which she tiredly plumped into bed, realizing how exhausted she was. The girl reminded herself to remove the pesky artifacts first. But what was the Duke's surprise when he looked in the mirror and noticed that for some reason her magical appearance was not activated despite the artifacts she was wearing. Rose immediately began listing the moments when this started happening and suggested that perhaps she had extra artifacts somewhere, after which she started going through every nook and cranny. The girl was very angry because the banquet was already tomorrow, and she did not understand where she could get more artifacts. For Rosa, it was another blow of fate. The girl didn't understand when the magic in the artifacts had been depleted. The girl speculated that perhaps Enoch could have done it. Even though she called him Enoch, his name is actually Adrian in the novel, and he is a dark mage. Later, he goes to the magic tower of his own volition, and despite being in hiding, he wants to gain power to save Yoru. Rose decided that he wouldn't have gotten away with such a small thing, but that said, the novel left out a lot of details about the mages, and so maybe she had forgotten something. Rosa decided that she needed to see Hugo, the creator of the magical artifacts. But first, the girl decided it would be worth it to change her clothes. Rosa put on the stealthiest clothes possible and was glad that she had some of Anna's rags saved just in case. Along the way, Rosa happened to come across some hair color changing pills and used them immediately. Rosa knew she wore this outfit when she went on errands, so the guards didn't check her out because they thought it was her. After a while, Rosa reached a rundown house by an old tree, after which she entered, informing Hugo that it was her. The man was delighted to see his special guest. The girl confessed that she had come because her artifacts had stopped working. Rosa opened a box of gems and told him that she had kept them for many years, so they were quite valuable. Hugo took a magnifying glass and examined each piece of jewelry, saying that if you looked closely, you could see faint marks. Rosa didn't really understand what kind of marks they were talking about, when suddenly, Hugo asked the girl if she had met a magician recently. Hugo explained that every mage has their own magic, traces of which they leave where they have been. Hugo guaranteed Rosa that all of his artifacts were free of defects, and he was sure she was aware that he used the best ingredients, magic stones, and spells for her orders. Only thing is, that mage is extraordinary. Rose reflected on the fact that Hugo's artifacts had never failed until she met Enoch. The man explained that if the mage realized who she was, even when she was wearing artifacts, then that person was obviously sensitive to magic. Hugo found this entertaining, for such people were a great rarity. And you can't protect yourself from them with any tricks, they can see through everything. Rose realized that Enoch knew who she was from the beginning. Hugo pulled the girl from her musings and said that judging by the traces, the magic had been taken away and then returned. The man wondered who this unusual person was. Rosa confessed that it was one crazy brat. Rosa was returning home and didn't even notice that Enoch was watching her at the time. The man never thought he would watch someone like that. Then he flapped his wings and flew away. The maid was adjusting her master's suit when suddenly the Duke appeared, announcing that Mistress Marigold had arrived. The maid informed her that she would go and meet with Mr. Hugo. Rose agreed and informed the maid that she was relying on her. The girl knew that the temporary artifacts were only valid for 2 days, so they needed to find new ones as soon as possible. Rosenta went down to the lobby and met his friend Vivian there. The girl was very happy to meet her friend, after which she remarked that he looked peerless. Rosenta paid the same compliment to his friend and said that she was even more beautiful and also noted her gorgeous outfit. Vivian brought a huge mountain of gifts for Rosenta, telling her that her brothers and father had recently traveled to another land and she had asked them to take a couple of gifts for him as well. Rosa decided that next time she would tell her that it was overkill, but ended up thanking Vivian. Rose spoke to one of the aristocrats, saying that she hoped they had enjoyed the banquet. The man who tied up his hair said he'd be looking forward to the next meeting as well. At this time, she observed this picture. Afterwards, she turned to the Duke and asked if he was bored. Suddenly, the son of the Helios Empire, His Majesty Emperor Theodore, appeared at the banquet. Everyone immediately bowed their heads when they saw His Highness. Theodore, noticing that Rosenta had also lowered his head, asked him to raise it, for he had come to give him a gift. Theodore held out a beautiful box with a pair of jewelry, knowing that his friend liked them very much. At this time, the guests were already whispering about how no one would have thought that the Emperor himself was coming. The girls were discussing among themselves that they had heard that the Duke and His Highness had been close since childhood. One girl shared that she didn't even know that Duke Estella, unlike Lady Vivian, doesn't attend banquets, and since they are together, they are definitely close friends. The three friends stood looking at the whole scene. Vivian shared that she felt like a caged monkey. Theodore realized that they had no other choice. After all, it was not their fault that they were famous and gorgeous. Rose, upon hearing this, was immediately ashamed. Vivian, on the other hand, was in agreement with Theodore. Suddenly, the girl turned to Rosenta to inquire whether he was better in company. Theodore admitted that he had specifically carved out time to come, so Rosenta should consider himself honored. Rosa laughed and couldn't help but admit that it was indeed an honor, then asked Theodore if he planned to stay until the end. Vivian revealed that her older brother had said that he would pick her up, so it was time for her to leave soon. His Highness admitted that he would like to stay, but he needs to get back so he can get up earlier tomorrow and get everything done. Besides, if he was here, he would take all the attention of the guests on himself. Rosa was glad that her friends would not stay long, for she did not want to be at the banquet until the night before. Rosa realized that when she left, the guests would slowly disperse. Later, being in her room, Rosa noticed that the maid Anna still had not returned. So the girl decided to go out on the balcony and suddenly noticed a raven. Rosa remembered that they say that crows are harbingers of trouble. Suddenly, out of nowhere, Enoch appeared on the balcony. The man was happy that they were meeting the Duke again. Rose inquired of Enoch what he was doing here. Suddenly, the man placed his palm on the girl's face, reminding her that he had said recently that they would see each other again. Rose hurriedly withdrew his hand and told him not to touch. Suddenly, Enoch asked the girl if he really shouldn't have learned her secret. The girl pretended as if she didn't know what he was talking about. But still, Rosa realized that it came out that he definitely knew everything. Enoch admitted that he doesn't understand why, but he wants to stay by her side. And he wants her to call his name every day. And to do that, he needs to become someone she will need. The girl didn't understand what the hell was going on, or why it sounded like a declaration of love. Rose realized that she almost asked Enoch if he was in love with her. The girl remembered that his feelings would change when Yora showed up, so there was no point in asking. Rose suggested that Enoch shake hands as a sign that this secret would remain just between them. Enoch agreed, and then held out his palm in return. Suddenly, the ring on Rosa's finger glowed, and she realized that this was her chance to say the words of the curse her father had taught her. Rosa knew that whoever carelessly admitted her secret would have a curse placed on their heart. Breaking it would cause their heart to burst into flames. Such was the curse of their agreement. Whereupon Rose informed Enoch that she had used the agreement and the curse. If he did not keep his promise, his heart would explode. Enoch decided that the engraving on his heart was like a bond, after which he asked Rosa if he would henceforth belong to her. The man touched the girl's face. Rosa didn't like it too much. whereupon she pulled away and told Enoch to leave. Enoch said before he left that he was sure they would have many more days together. Then he turned into a raven and flew away, leaving Rose alone. The next day, the girl had a headache after drinking at the banquet, and during the carriage ride she felt nauseous. Vivian noticed her friend's condition and then asked if the coachman should be hurried to stop. Rosenta assured her that it was fine, since they could be late for a meeting if they asked the coachman to stop. Vivian said that if she had known that would be the case, she wouldn't have planned anything after the banquet. Rosenta hadn't expected to feel so bad himself. Rosa looked out the carriage window and noticed that the sky was clear today. The girl remembered very well how Yora had fallen from the sky on a weather day like this. And when there are no clouds, you can see the moon. The girl hoped it wouldn't happen today. At this time, I, the fool, being in the garden, noticed that the purple Hera did not look like Rosenta, whereupon His Highness thought that he hoped his friend would be pleased. And just like that, his girlfriend and best friend appeared in front of Theodore. Theodore was very happy to see Rosenta, after which he handed him a bouquet of flowers. Vivian and Rosa were incredibly surprised by such an act on Theodore's part. His Highness explained that she was the girl here, and why there were no flowers for her. He thought it was a real opinion that only ladies could receive flowers. Vivian realized that Theodore must be proud of his progressive thoughts. His Highness explained that it was one of the virtues of a wise ruler. As a result, Theodore agreed to pick some flowers now. Vivian replied that it would be great if he did it ahead of time, but it wasn't critical. Later, sitting at the table, Vivian discussed with Rose that Theodore was sly but looked very attractive. Vivian clarified that she did not mean that His Majesty was more handsome than Rosenta, because he was handsome, and Theodore was attractive. Rosenta asked Vivian if she was implying that he wasn't manly. At that very second, Vivian felt very foolish. Rose noticed that Theodore was at this time painstakingly choosing flowers. Suddenly, Vivian looked up into the sky and noticed that there was a comet flying by. Rosenta was greatly surprised to see it flying straight at Theodore. Vivian had already clung to her friend Rosenta, after which he assured her that there was no need to worry because nothing would happen to His Majesty. Rosa realized that Theodore should boldly catch her, just as it was described in the book. As a result, after a couple of seconds, Theodore already had the girl in his arms. Rosa didn't even expect her appearance to be so spectacular. Rose remembered that in the book it was written that Yora landed safely in Theodore's arms, and they looked at each other calmly. Vivian, who was watching the whole scene, didn't understand what was going on. Rosenta explained that he wasn't sure himself, so he thought it would be a good idea to see if His Majesty was all right first. Vivian looked at the girl and asked her friend if the divine light was accidentally emanating from her, to which Rose gave an affirmative answer. Yora received divine power from Luce, the goddess of light, who is now worshipped in the Holy Land. There is no priest here who can be her equal. Even His Holiness has trouble summoning a glow the size of a fist. On the other hand, Theodore's divine power is linked to Harmony, an ancient goddess that has long since disappeared. It comes from the golden divine power and the ancient paladins, possibly due to the first temple that existed before the founding of the empire. This kind of power could only be used by members of the Helios imperial family. Rose was sure that it was just another privilege of the protagonist, after which she ran up to her friend and asked if he was all right. Except that Theodore didn't hear anything, because he was completely fascinated by the girl who had just fallen from the sky. Yora at this time did not understand what was happening to her and assumed that she was in a dream. The girl remembered how she was walking to the academy when she suddenly fell through a trapdoor. She fell like Alice in Wonderland and squinted hard. And when she opened her eyes, she met her gaze with a guy from whom a golden glow was emanating. The girl hung in the air and did not realize where she was. Yora at first assumed it was a conscious dream. Suddenly, a voice said that she had answered the call and was now being sent here, to the Helios Empire, to its very center. Yora immediately perked up when she assumed it was a dimensional transition. After all, she had read about such a thing in a couple of romantic fantasy books her friend had recommended to her. Yora wondered at the unknown voice if she was some sort of messenger of God. The next day, in the Temple of Nota, the capital, the ministers were discussing what they would do if this was true. After all, something strange had happened yesterday, and the girl had fallen into the Emperor's hands and exuded silver divine power, saying that she was definitely a saint. Another cleric suggested that it would be better to take a message to His Holiness just in case. Another man at the table suggested that it would be better to make sure it was true from the first. The priest named Canatel said that he thought they were all right, and he would personally go to the palace for that reason, since the saintess was one of them, so they couldn't lose her just because she had fallen into the Helios Empire, even if into the hands of the emperor himself. The other clerics supported the man, saying that this girl is a gift from God, and the Holy Land should take care of her safety, because the Helios Empire cannot be allowed to steal a divine gift. At this time, Rose felt strange, for she had planned to visit the palace to inquire about what happened yesterday, but all the heads of the nobility were called here. A maid came to the Duke and told him that she had been ordered to escort him to another place. Rose was surprised to hear that she was not being escorted to a room or office. After a while, the maid led Rosa to the West Circle, where the aristocrats' reception is held. Rosa wondered why Theodore had called her to such a place, and then asked the maid if she was sure that the Duke wanted to come here, to which she received an affirmative answer. Theodore at this time sat leaning over the bed in which the girl was sleeping. Rose walked over and pulled up a chair to sit next to him, and asked her friend what he was worried about. A smile immediately shone on Theodore's face when he saw Rosenta. The Duke asked the Emperor if he didn't have the strength to deny that he had fallen in love with this beautiful creature. The man replied that if he had fallen in love with beauty, he and Vivian would have been first in line. Rosa was pleased that she too was listed among the beautiful people. That said, the girl had hoped that the joke would cheer Theodore up, but that wasn't like him. His Highness explained that he hadn't slept well the night before, and so fatigue was driving him out of his mind. Rosenta assured her friend that everything was fine, for his dark circles under his eyes were visible even from here, and they were about to go down to his chin. Theodore was surprised, worried that his circles under his eyes were really that dark, and Rosa only laughed in response. Theodore leaned back in his chair and wondered how Vivian was doing, to which Rosenta replied that she was frightened. Only Theodore wasn't surprised to hear that, and said that Rosenta was good for taking her home. Rosa wondered whether Theodore's feeling for Yora was manifested in the same way as it had been in the novel. The girl worried that if it wasn't fatigue that was irritating him, and suddenly he couldn't make sense of what he was feeling, and given the way he was looking at her, maybe he didn't like her at all. Theodore turned to his friend Rosenta and said that he was very glad that she had come today. Rosa noticed that her friend's gaze wasn't as clouded as it had been yesterday, then admitted that she was glad too. In the palace guest room, the men gathered around the table and began to discuss what the rumors are. And there are also subordinates who have witnessed it. And if it was true, then the Holy Land would try to take the Holy Land for themselves. Someone spoke out that it couldn't be allowed to happen, determined that they would keep it, because other nations would then treat them with reverence, and the Great Holy Land wouldn't even have time to squeak. Rosenta was tired of listening to this, after which he told everyone to shut up, after which His Highness began to speak, saying that he had called the meeting because to inform them of the truth behind the gossip. And Theodore also added that he had the last word, and he would decide whether to keep or send the saint away when he discussed it with Duke Estella and Lady Marigold. After His Highness had spoken, he immediately did a reversal of his spell. His Highness asked the people present, would he make a decision that would harm the Helios Empire? Rosenta replied that His Highness was free to do as he wished. The other men at the table immediately supported Rosenta, saying that His Majesty was insightful, and in the end, they were grateful that he had shared his thoughts with them beforehand. Suddenly, there was a knock on the door, whereupon a butler entered the room, informing His Majesty that he had an urgent message. The man said that the high priest from the temple in Helios had arrived. Theodore rushed into the girl's bedroom and saw that the high priest was already sitting next to the saint's bed. Tears appeared in the high priest's eyes when he saw the divine gift coming from the girl. Theodore became very angry and didn't understand how this priest dared to do anything. He tried to separate their hands as suddenly an incredibly bright and beautiful glow formed in the room. Rose was already angry at the damn book, remembering that when the high priest touched it, nothing happened. The exception came when Theodore touched it. The girl assumed that all the dramatic effects were available only to the main characters, because the novel clearly stated that the powerful light appeared when all eyes were fixed on them, and it was as if the saint was meant for Theodore. She opened her eyes as soon as he touched her. That's when everyone finally realized it. After falling from the sky, her first priority was not to become a saint, but to save the emperor. Theodore had nothing to save him from, unlike the situation described in the prologue. As soon as the girl came to her senses, she saw a picture of 3 men bowing before her, calling her a saint. Yora met Theodore's gaze, after which he shivered and looked away. In that second, Rosenta noticed that the glow had disappeared. Duke Stella looked at his friend and didn't understand why his friend had such a strange look, for he was nervous as if he felt guilty. The girl hesitantly inquired where she was and who they were. Everyone further began to calm Yoru down. The priests acted as if they were educators, telling her all about the world and explaining how important she was to it. Surprisingly, Yora took the situation calmly, which made Rosenta feel that something was clearly going wrong. The girl tried to prove that she was not a saint at all, but a very ordinary person. But everyone insisted otherwise because it was impossible, because she radiated silver divine power, which was a direct proof of her sainthood. Rose remembered that often the protagonists of novels behave like that, and perhaps she was just overreacting. The girl was angry at the damn plot and its damn monotonous protagonists. The high priest was sure she was a saint, and so he asked her to go with them to the Holy Land, for her presence would shine even brighter, and her holiness would welcome her with open arms. Rosa, looking at the whole situation, remembered that in the original, Theodore had cut in on their conversation. Rosenta then turned to His Highness to inquire if he was going to interfere. Theodore replied that he didn't see a single reason to interfere. But instead of Theodore, the Marquis Marigold intervened in the conversation, clearly unhappy that the girl would be sent to the Holy Land. The man argued that the saint had fallen here, right into the hands of His Highness, so in a sense they had a right to protect her. The priest disagreed with my lord and pointed out that he was talking complete nonsense. His Highness next to him said that it was unlikely that the Marquis could do it alone, and so he thought His Highness should intervene. His Highness also noticed that his friend looked a little tired. Rose decided to joke that she was very chipper compared to him. This time, the joke succeeded, and Theodore smiled as well. After that, he entered the conversation, saying that at this rate they wouldn't come to any decision today. His Highness approached the girl and decided to ask her directly where she would like to stay, the Holy Land or the Helios Empire. The saint, unsure, inquired that if she said she wanted to go to the Holy Land, would they let her go? But the girl received a favorable answer, for His Highness had informed her that the decision was hers. Yora looked with her brown eyes into His Highness's eyes and asked if he wanted her to stay. Theodore asked the girl if his answer would help her make up her mind, but Yora gave an affirmative answer. Afterward, at the negotiating table, the priests did not give up the idea that they should have the saint, for they had much to tell her. One of the priests said that the girl didn't understand who she was, so they should explain to her about Luz and divine power. Besides, if someone from the Holy Land told her everything, she might change her mind. Rosenta, looking at this whole situation, noticed that first they stated that it was enough for them to just be around her, and now they were talking like this. Duke Estella asked the priests if they really wanted to stay here. In response, a barrage of insults fell on Rosa because he does not understand anything at all. The girl was tired of hearing them say the same thing. Rose had heard it hundreds of times since becoming a member of the Estella family. If one didn't hope to hurt her or suppress her, it was worth finding a different approach. After which, Rosa inquired to the priests, "Even so what?" His Majesty intervened in the conversation, saying that they were the ones who barged in here and were not even able to observe the banal rules of decency, but they had the courage to teach others. His Majesty said that they seemed to be the only scumbags here. Theo didn't understand how people with such rotten speeches could help a saint. The high priest entered the conversation. He said that it was entirely his fault, and he had ceased to think soberly, as all his thoughts were occupied with the saint, whereupon he asked His Majesty to accept his sincere apology. He said that he would allow only one man from the temple to remain here as his personal tutor. The priests were not much pleased with this. They asked him to explain to them why it was for the sake of the saint to stay in the empire. After all, she had made that choice because she lacked understanding. Rose was already tired of how annoying they were, and wondered if the power they called repulsive would work on people who considered themselves the holiest in the entire world. Rose didn't argue that she wanted to do it more out of annoyance than experimentation for the sake of it, whereupon the girl uttered the word silence. Rose noticed that they had nothing to oppose her and was pleased with that. She was sure that it was extremely humiliating for them to fall under the effects of a power they shunned, except that the high priest looked unfazed and smiled. The high priest said that he was sure his decision was the most sensible. However, he had one request. Theodore strained a smile and asked the high priest what his request was. The man explained that His Holiness had gone to save the poor, and he was so far away that they could not contact him, and until such an opportunity arose, the high priest asked the emperor to allow the saint to help. After a while, the girl was dressed in a beautiful gown, and Theodore froze in utter shock when he saw her. He noticed that her eyes sparkle every time she walks towards him, and her gaze, full of tenderness, never breaks away from him. As soon as their gazes crossed, Theodore's heart began to beat faster. But the man found it disgusting, and every time he repeated to himself that he had to overcome these inexplicable, contradictory, and strange feelings, because even though he tried to avoid meeting her, every day they crossed each other more often. And when this happened, he was overwhelmed with emotion and his heart went out of control. The reason for this was not clear, for he had never shared his feelings with anyone before. Theodore realized that he was a very stroppy emperor, but still, then he graciously put on a smile, after which Saintess asked His Majesty how he was doing. No expression on her face, her voice, or even her movements went unnoticed by Theodore. He was sure that by all this, she was showing interest in him. The man assured her that he was doing well and asked the saint if she was doing well. Saint said that thanks to His Majesty, she could sleep well at night. The girl also added that the high priest named Canatel has taught her a lot, and every day is full of new exciting events. Yora shared that this place is totally different from where she used to live before. Therefore, she is very curious to learn about everything. The maids, looking behind the whole scene, couldn't get enough of how cute the saint was and even looked like an adorable bird. Theodore pretended to be happy to hear that. Suddenly, Saint asked His Majesty if he could keep her company at dinner. Theodore agreed and asked the girl to choose a day when it would be convenient for her. Suddenly, the high priest Canatel entered the conversation, noting that it was rather chilly today and the girl was not dressed warmly enough, then asked if she would mind going to her chambers. The saint addressed His Majesty, saying that she was sure that he had already dined today, so she asked to postpone their meeting to another time. Whereupon the girl withdrew with the high priest Canatel. Left alone, Theodore noticed that his mind was clouded, which was why he was responding out of inertia. The man felt as if he was being manipulated, and it was as if he was blinded. It was incredibly infuriating to him. At this time, Rosenta was in his chambers, when suddenly the maid Anna said that he often visits the palace, but she would not stop worrying about his appearance. The girl began to go through the things on the rack, selecting what would fit better. Rosa thought about the fact that Theodore had not called her and Vivian for a long time, so the girl assumed that perhaps things with Velcia had been resolved. The girl was brought out of her musings by Anna's voice inquiring about the costume. When the costume was finished, the girl decided that she needed to pick out shoes and accessories. Rosenta read the news in the newspaper that everyone, including the dukes, had gathered at Noda to meet the saint. The girl assumed that the hype must have been raised by the fact that she was the first saint in the last couple hundred years. After the first day the ancient temple collapsed, no more saints appeared. The side that had a saint dominated the rest, and its people directly demanded it. Rose was sure that the saint loves Theodore, which would entail endless difficulties even for Vivian. Suddenly, the head butler named Edmund entered the room, informing Rosenta that everything was ready and he could leave for the palace. Rosenta thanked her subordinate and said that she knew she could trust him with such a task. Edmund had grown up in a simple family, and many aristocrats were prejudiced against the decision to give a commoner the position of head butler, but in the book it was not considered an oversight. Rose asked Edmund the butler how the search for his personal servant was going. Edmund apologized to my lord, explaining that all the servants on the estate were not suitable, but he would consider training them again in all the necessary skills. Rosenta decided that since that was the case, let Edmund look for suitable candidates among the outsiders. After all, she doesn't care about their backgrounds, so Edmund can choose anyone he deems suitable. She gives him 2 days to do so. The probationary butler named Dennis said that they wouldn't take anyone as the Duke's personal servant. The other servants were surprised that Duke Estella is looking for a servant. One of the men commented that they would not take a man for the position of personal servant regardless of his background, so they figured it was a lure to sell them into slavery. Suddenly, the man approached Denny's butler, asking if it was true that they were trafficking people, and he was asked to lure them. The butler tried to change the man's mind that it wasn't true, as the head butler had given him such an assignment, namely to find a suitable candidate among the commoners. Although it is difficult, but experience is very important. To top it all off, the head butler is extremely selective, so the servants from their estate didn't fit his criteria, and Denny was beginning to feel like he was looking for something that simply didn't exist. People did not understand how so, because they were sure that the servants in the Duke's estate had decent origins and excellent abilities. And even if they didn't qualify, they wouldn't be able to. The butler understood that it was expected, and Edmund should have chosen someone from the existing servants after all. Danny decided that Edward was being too perfectionistic and thought it would be a good idea to post the notices in the square. Suddenly, one flyer flew to the ground as Enoch picked it up. The man assumed that they would see each other again soon. Rosa sat in the carriage and was shocked at the huge crowd that had gathered for the saint. The coachman wondered to the guard how much longer they would be standing here. How could they keep the Duke waiting so long? The guard apologized and explained that they were in a lot of trouble because of the crowd, and then offered a ride. Only Rose entered the palace, as Vivian suddenly swooped down on her excitedly. The girl hugged her friend tighter and confessed that she missed her a lot. Vivian said that, to be honest, she had tried to come to his estate without the knowledge of her father and brothers, but she had been spotted and was now being watched all the time. The girl was angry and didn't understand why they were all acting like this. Rosenta explained that he had asked them to take extra special care of her since she was still reeling from the shock, so he asked the girl not to get too mad at them. Rosenta patted his friend on the head, thus making Vivian angry, for she was no longer a child. The three friends sat at the table, and Rosenta asked Vivian if this was her first time at the palace since then. The girl was greatly distressed at what they were seeing, and so much so that for several days she angrily tore her handkerchiefs to pieces. She was very discouraged at home and began to learn to draw. The girl said that her teacher was an attractive famous artist, and he praised her talent. Rosenta couldn't even bother to draw. The girl proudly fixed her hair in response. Suddenly, Vivian noticed that Theodore was silent all the time, after which she wondered if he had something to tell them. The girl said that he had a strange, pensive look on his face, which only said that he was upset about something. Rose realized that Vivian was right. She had seen him in that state since their very first meeting, and he frowned his forehead at the sight of Vivian. Still, Theodore decided to deny it, saying it was nothing. But Vivian can't be fooled, because she has known Theodore for a long time, and it may sound surprising, but she once had feelings for him. And in general, the girl thinks that she does not need to explain anything, because she sees everything. Theodore decided to gloat, and reminded the girl of the times when she had feelings for him. Rose, who was watching the whole scene, realized that Theodore had purposely changed the subject by starting to tease. However, Vivian was not the kind of person who would let him move away from the conversation he had started. Rose realized that in high society behaves like the best fighter on the battlefield. She asked her friend in a serious tone what was going on with him. Rosenta entered the conversation, turning to Theodore, and said that he could tell, for he had called them because of what he had been doing with Saint until it was resolved. Theodore explained that it wasn't because of that at all. Vivian, though displeased, was still grateful that Rosenta had brought it up, for Vivian had almost had a heart attack because of that woman. And now she was being kept under observation, worried about her health. And now this saint had also managed to upset Theodore. Rosenta found it very funny that Vivian was jealous that the saint had managed to upset Theodore, unlike her. And it seemed Vivian's resentment wasn't even directed at her. The girl didn't understand how Rosenta could say such horrible things. Theodore supported his friend's joke, saying that he did not think that Vivian still had feelings for him. The girl was already slowly starting to lose her temper, saying that Theodore was her nemesis in general. Suddenly Theodore's tone changed, and he said that a lot of strange things have happened in the last couple of days, and it's like someone is messing with his feelings, or even controlling him like a puppet. Suddenly, Saint burst into the room, taking the three friends by surprise. Theodore, upon seeing the girl, immediately became serious, and then inquired why she had come. Later, the high priest joined the meal. He said that he was to blame, and also added that he had heard the maids talking, and they said that His Majesty had asked them to prepare for a special feast. So it seemed to the girl that it was for His Highness, considering what they had agreed upon with him beforehand, and because of Yora's rashness. Tears came to the girl's eyes, and she explained that after promising to do so, His Highness still hadn't sent her word, so she thought that the feast was being organized for her. Whereupon the saint apologized to His Highness. Vivian was clearly unhappy with the situation, and then asked the saint if it was a good idea to clarify things in advance in such situations. Rosa, watching the picture unfold, realized that it seemed that Vivian seemed to have the saint on her bad side, despite the fact that the answer was a bit harsh. Still, the girl decided that perhaps the plot of the novel was having that effect. Still, Rose pushed those thoughts aside, for if it were justified, Vivian and Theodore would not get along. Vivian had heard that Yora came from another world, and so my lady assumed that basic rules of behavior were not taught there. Vivian also added that His Majesty always asked the servants to stay outside the door, and so my lady couldn't even believe that no one had stopped the saint while she was on her way to the dining hall. Vivian decided that, to put it mildly, the servants' discipline was lame. Yora, wiping away her tears, pleaded not to punish the servants, for surely they couldn't stop her because she was a saint. The girl promised that such a thing would not happen again. As a result, a very unpleasant atmosphere hung in the room. So Rosa decided to enter the conversation by addressing the saint. Yora admitted that even though they had not had a chance to talk, she remembered her face. Rosenta asked Saint if she was comfortable living in the palace, to which she received a positive answer. The girl also added that His Majesty was treating her well, and the others were acting friendly as well. Suddenly, Saint said that she was curious about something, and she had heard that Rosenta was in love with someone. Yora immediately envied the man, for he was very lucky to have such a kind man in his life. Rosenta was slightly shocked when he heard this. Suddenly, Vivian entered the conversation and turned to Saint and said that she was too active in sticking her nose into other people's lives. The girl then got up from the table and said that she wanted to leave because she felt like an unexpected guest at someone else's dinner, considering that she and Saint didn't really know each other. So Vivian fears that at this rate, this lunch will give her indigestion. Theodore asked Vivian to sit down and added that she had gotten it all wrong, except that the girl refused. Rosa, watching the whole picture, did not understand at what point everything went in the wrong direction, although it all started innocuously enough. The girl assumed that perhaps it was the effect of the presence of the main character, and it was clearly not the most pleasant thing. Suddenly, Theodore became angry and with a shout ordered to sit down now. The girl was very frightened and did not expect such behavior from her friend. Theodore, in fact, did not expect such behavior from himself. Rosa immediately went to her friend and whispered in his ear that he looked tired, so she suggested that they finish for today and meet another time. Rosenta indicated that he would probably go and asked Vivian why she wouldn't join him. The girl agreed without any thought. After leaving the room, Rosenta asked Vivian why she was acting so aggressively towards the saint, since it was not like her at all. The girl admitted that she had been sitting across from her and had seen everything. In fact, Saint was not crying at all, and Vivian's intuition tells her that this girl is dangerous. Theodore ended up alone with Saint, after which the girl asked His Majesty if he was all right. Saint admitted that she had heard that Lady Mary Gold was His Highness's fiancée, and she ended up just leaving with the Duke. Theodore was not surprised. After all, many people think William is his bride, and it turns out that Saint thinks so too. But he didn't understand why this was happening, since she was like a sister to him. Saint had also heard that the Duke and his fiancée had been close since childhood. But if she didn't know that, she would have thought that she was engaged to the Duke. At that very second, Theodore lost his temper and started yelling at the girl. At that moment, the man felt that he was finally in control of his own body. Theodore speculated that perhaps it was because of unfounded anger that outweighed the incomprehensible force that was forcing him to act against his wishes. The man exhaled and told Saint to watch her words and be careful what she said, even in jest, if she wanted to stay in the palace. Today was a strange day where Saint had to control her every word. And Theodore also, after Vivian and Rosenta left, he couldn't control his body properly. He felt like there was something wrong with it. Theodore was sure that everyone was only talking about him falling in love with Saint and betraying Vivian. Although in reality, Vivian is more like a sister to him. And next to Saint, he was doubtful because he felt strange during their meetings. However, it is completely impossible that this unpleasant and burdensome emotion is love. Theodore rose from the table and announced that he too would go, after which he wished Saint to enjoy the company of the high priest Canatel. As he left the room, Theodore understood why he continued to be angry and assumed it was because he believed in the possibility of Rosenta and Vivian marrying. The man understood that if it were to happen, such an event was worth celebrating. And Vivian had been hanging around him for years, but still he didn't understand from the bottom of his heart what this mysterious emotion was all about. Moreover, the man didn't realize which one of them he envied. Theodore decided that after all the strange events that had happened recently, he could clearly feel himself going crazy. On the way home, Rose noticed that even after leaving the palace, she couldn't stop thinking about what had happened. It had seemed to her that the appearance of the saint hadn't really affected anything, but today it was obvious that some sort of rift had occurred. It felt as if their relationship was going to end, with an imprint that could never be erased. Besides, Vivian's words were still bothering Rosa. The girl understood that Vivian could not be wrong, because, given the years spent since childhood with hypocrites who are only interested in riches, she sees through people, and therefore Rosa cannot ignore her judgment. However, the girl also admitted that it is not enough, because there is no proof, and she is not going to take Vivian's word for it. Besides, it is already clear that the world of nobles is not so simple. Rose decided that, given the situation, she should take a closer look at the saint if they ever met again. Besides, she didn't understand why Theodore had such a strange expression on his face when he apologized. He wasn't the type to let his emotions get the best of him. She was brought out of her thoughts by a loud voice that announced that they had already arrived at the manor. The Duke thanked the coachman and said that today he was not planning to go anywhere else, so he could be free. The coachman took the Duke's words to heart and warned him to be careful when going downstairs. The lord was immediately greeted by the maid Anna. Rosenta inquired of the girl if nothing had happened in his absence. She admitted that nothing worthwhile had happened and added that Edmund was busy at the moment and was interviewing candidates. Rose hadn't expected it to happen so quickly, though it wasn't surprising that he'd managed so quickly, then asked the maid to take him to Edmund the butler. Anna obediently obeyed my lord. On the way, everyone discussed the presence of Duke Estella. Rose, looking at the whole scene, was shocked to see so many people, as if a large corporation was recruiting employees. Rose didn't understand where Edmund had managed to post so many advertisements describing the vacancy. As she passed by, Rosa realized that, judging from the mannerisms of the conversation, it was clear that the people here were from different social classes. The maid stopped near the door and turned to my lord to notify him that they had arrived. Before entering, Rosenta warned that it was him. The butler Edmund was slightly surprised, but still warned my lord that the place was a bit of a mess, and if he wasn't discouraged, he would be right out. What was Rosa's surprise when she had not yet released the handle and the door had already opened, and by the volume of the voice it appeared that Edmund was somewhere in the back of the room. As soon as Rose entered the room, she was immediately greeted by a familiar voice. The girl turned around immediately to see the man, but there was no one behind her. For accuracy, Rosa decided to ask the butler if there was someone behind him now, to which Edmund said that he had not seen anyone when he came out. Rosa decided that she had imagined it, because she could hear things, because today's event had made her mad. The girl decided to just go and rest in her chambers. At this time, the maid was standing near the door to the saint's room. Yora had warned the maid in advance that she would not allow anyone to enter her room. And all because the girl was flooding with tears of resentment. That's what she was yelled at. The girl remembered that even her parents had never raised their voices at her, and she had tried so hard to earn His Majesty's favor, and in the end, everything had turned against her. The high priest entered the room, addressing Saint Rhea, the daughter of light sent down by the goddess Luz. Kenatel asked the girl not to be sad, for he was sure that everything would end with His Highness eventually loving her. The girl immediately began to convince the high priest otherwise, for he had seen what had happened. Kenatel was sure that His Majesty was simply confused. The high priest explained that the blessing he had given the girl simply could not fail. Meanwhile, at Estella Manor, Rose was trying her best to rid herself of unnecessary thoughts after that day and squeeze the most out of each day by loading herself up with work. The girl was completely immersed in improving her abilities in her father's study today. Rose assumed it was just the mysterious sound of the words. That said, her father had said that if she knew how to skillfully make words sound sacred and cause a powerful influence, she would be an outstanding necromancer. And from the knowledge she had gained in her past life, she knew that necromancers could control corpses and handle poisonous substances. In books and games, they were called dark mages and devil interrupters. But Rose wasn't sure if that description of a necromancer fit the realities of this world. She just remembered that when her father was still alive, he had forbidden her to remove the magical artifacts that suppressed her power. But now her father wasn't around, and the girl suggested that maybe she should take them off. Whereupon she told the rings to remove themselves from her hand. But in the end, the power was so great that Rosa realized that she couldn't handle it because it was too much for her. It reminded the girl of the times her father had unleashed his power on the estate. Each time, his nails would turn black as if they had been dipped in darkness. Her father had told his daughter that the same thing would happen to her when the darkness filled her, if the day came when he told her of a hidden place where she could develop her power. In that same second, Rose had an epiphany as she remembered the secret place. The girl couldn't believe that she had forgotten about it at all, and had never even remembered it once. Rose began to ponder where it might be. She remembered that her father was away from home for a long time, and then returned and locked himself in his chambers or on the upper floor, which was always closed to outsiders. And even she was forbidden to go there. Hence, the girl thought of this secret place being located there. What was the girl's surprise when, after leaving the room, she came across Edmund the butler. The man had come to inform her that he had finally found her a suitable servant. Rose decided that since he had personally come to tell her about him, it must be an incredible man. Edward decided that my lord would be pleased, for he was sure that he would make an excellent servant. Rosa decided that if Edmund trusted him, it was already a good sign. Rosenta decided that he would need training first, and then asked Edmund the butler to plan his schedule for him. The butler obediently obeyed, then asked permission to bow out, as he still had duties to attend to. When Rosa went up to the secret place, she suddenly noticed that there was absolutely nothing here. The girl did not understand why it was here that her father forbade her to always enter. The girl began to knock on the walls, assuming that perhaps there was a secret passage. But in the end, it turned out that there was nothing like that here. Rose assumed that she had reached the limit of her power, but the only thing that comforted him was the beautiful views from here. Suddenly, Rosa heard some sort of carping and realized it was Enoch. The man was glad that the Duke was always quick to recognize him. Rosante wondered to Enoch what it was he was wearing. Enoch inquired of the Duke what he thought of his appearance. Rose asked the man if he expected her to give him a few compliments. Enoch adjusted his monocle and tie, then asked the Duke to allow him to introduce himself properly. The man then introduced himself by the name Enoch Wolf, and added that he was the Duke's new personal servant from an unnamed town in the province. In response, Rose asked the man to go back to where he had come from, but Enoch refused, as he wanted to be near the Duke. Rosenta did not understand why on earth he would want to be near him. Enoch explained that it was because he had given him the name, and because of the Duke, he was able to survive in a world filled with pain and darkness. Rose realized that Enoch had endured life in a monstrous magical tower, and because of a name. Enoch took a strand of the Duke's hair and reminded him that it was he himself who had sought him out when he was in hiding. Well, to be more accurate, Rose just didn't recognize him, since they had only seen each other as children. As it was, she would never have looked for him. The girl decided that she couldn't contact him anymore because she didn't need him, and it was time to end it. The girl decided that instead of useless bickering, she would ask Edmund the butler to fire him as soon as possible. Suddenly, Enoch said that he had noticed a trace here. Rose was greatly surprised when she heard it. Hugo had told her that magic left behind a trace, but he said that even with expensive magic artifacts, one could see only a hint of a trace. Rosa didn't understand how Enoch had managed to do it. The girl assumed that someone who was sensitive to magic could see the magical traces left here. Enoch noticed that the Duke had decided on an answer. The man realized that the Duke would return him tomorrow since he no longer needed him, which was very unfriendly of him. But since that was the case, the man decided to create a reason for the Duke to need him. Rosenta asked Enoch to tell him what he was seeing now. In response, the man held out his hand and offered the Duke a deal, and added that he would have no regrets. Rosa realized that if she shook his hand, it would be harder for her to push Enoch away in the future. But the girl decided that there was no reason to hesitate, then held out her palm in return. Enoch had a request for him. He wanted the Duke to publicly declare Enoch his servant. He would then tell him about the trail. Later, the Duke gathered all his subjects, as it was obvious that some of them had already seen Enoch, but he wanted to formally introduce them to the new butler, who would not work as his servant. Enoch had already blended in, and Rose, who was watching, realized that he was pretending to be a goody-goody, and no one would even consider that he was the famous lunatic from the dark alley. The Duke asked the rest of his subjects to help him get settled here. Later, upon arriving at the very spot where they had recently met, the butler asked the Duke to take a look at the bricks, specifically the fact that they had different colors. Enoch explained that footprints were just footprints, and there was no way to know their direction, and then began to use his magic. Rose didn't understand why he was doing this, since people might come running. But Enoch assured the Duke that there was no need to worry. He used his silencing magic, so no one would hear them. At least that made Rose happy. The two men then entered the tunnel made by Enoch. After a couple of seconds, the Duke turned around and told the butler to follow him. Enoch agreed without too much bickering. Eventually, after some time, and Rose came across a door in such a place, then entered and saw that there was a laboratory inside. What caught the girl's attention was a flash sculpture. Rosa realized that there was a lot her father hadn't told her about. In the book, when Saint fell from heaven, Rosenta Estella only appeared in Saint's presence, and even then, only briefly. Usually he would have a word or two with someone, or listen to what a caring look he had. The girl didn't know much about him, but his capabilities were limitless. That was why the girl decided that she would have to figure it all out for herself. Still, she was sure that there was no cause for concern, for she was just an unimportant minor character. Rose was looking at the books on the shelf when suddenly she noticed one very suspicious book, shackled with chains. The girl tried to break the chains, but realized that the book was very firmly shackled, after which she put it back in its place. Suddenly, Rosa noticed that there was something else here. Namely, a book about the undead. Undead is the term used for corpses that have come back to life. And Rosa finally found something related to necromancy. The girl knew that even an army could be raised from the undead. But other people would probably see that possibility as nothing but devilishness. Rose realized that it would be a good idea to use it without attracting other people's attention. Suddenly, there were some sounds behind her, and the girl hurriedly closed the book and put it away. Enoch explained that a servant was trying to deliver a letter, so he was coming, that it would be better for him to approach the Duke himself rather than someone else. Rose irritably asked the butler to hand over the letters. The man was amused at such a harsh tone. But Rosa did not think it was necessary for gentlemen to be considerate of their own servants. Rosenta asked the butler if he was offended, but she received a negative answer, and Enoch explained that he simply remembered his childhood when he had been more emotional. The girl grabbed one of the letters and then exhaled tiredly, for she wanted to lock herself in here and read a book, but she would have to save that reading for later. The girl realized that she would be 100% misunderstood if she carried it around with her. Suddenly, Rose noticed the book on spell theories and realized that it was suitable, because that was the strength of her family. After which, she walked out of the secret room. Then she turned to the butler and told him that he was not allowed to come here anymore. The men left, and the Duke noticed that there was now a huge devastation around. If left like this, someone would definitely come inside. Suddenly, the butler spoke to the Duke. saying that since they had destroyed the spell that had been set up here, they should cast a new one. After that, everything went back to the way it was. After a couple of seconds, Rose saw that the surroundings were now perfectly clean. The girl realized that this was the magical power of the future head of the mage in the tower. The Duke asked the butler if the new spell could be improved. The latter explained sharply that it was worth saying his name and the passage would immediately open. The butler also asked the Duke to think of him every time he did so. Rose could understand when Theodore and Vivian texted her, but suddenly Duchess Nikki Cardia texted her. The girl remembered that they had met once when she was with her father. Nikki Cardia is known for her difficult character. She has the ability to handle plants. She is a great fit for Sylvia's lands, which are managed by Nikki's family. Rose decided that she should read Vivian's letters first. The girl in the letter asked her best friend if he got an invitation today. She said she wanted to rip him to shreds right away, but refrained. The girl didn't want to go and still couldn't understand how Theodore could yell at her. The girl was sure that it was definitely because of the saint. The girl also added that if it were her will, she would never go, but her parents and brothers would be there, so it was hard to refuse. Vivian admitted that she didn't want to miss the opportunity to meet Rosenta and the saint, and his majesty is still terrible. Rosa then began to read a letter from Theodore. The man there wrote that he hoped they could meet before the banquet, for there was something he had not had time to say before. The girl realized that the banquet was not far off. Yora is the star of the festivities, so she will probably be there, as will Vivian and Theodore. Rosenta realized that this was his chance to get answers to his questions. If he was lucky, he might even find out what position he would occupy in the future. Except he was disappointed that there wasn't an easier way. Rosenta picked up the last letter. Suddenly, the man remembered the first time he saw Theodore in a tree like this. Rosenta realized that he missed those days. At this time, Duchess Cardia asked her ward if he had sent Duke Estella that letter, to which the man answered in the affirmative and said that he had done as he had been ordered. The Duchess was very much interested in what this boy had grown up to be. The girl realized that if he had been a member of the Cart family, he would have lived life as he was born. But he was lucky enough to be in a family of conservatives and douchebags. Because of this, the girl felt sorry for him. Days passed. The date of the banquets in honor of the saint was approaching, but it had no effect on Rosa's daily life. She spent her time in the tower on the top floor, devoting every spare minute to reading the theory on curses. Rosenta remembered that today was to be a scheduled visit from the Duchess of Cardia. The Duke turned to the butler and inquired where the Duchess was now. The butler informed him to wait a moment while he checked, and then he eyed one of the ravens and reported that so far she was nowhere to be seen in the vicinity. That made the Duke realize that meant he still had time. He thought about the fact that the butler could use magic, and his duties as a servant were excellent, and he was of much use. Rose was reading a letter that said the Duchess would like to visit his estate. The girl realized that they would have met at the banquet anyway, but the Duchess needed to see her before it began. The girl suggested that perhaps she just wanted to know how much she had grown since she was a child. That woman was imprinted in her memories as incredibly charming and strong. She was the direct definition of the word beauty. Rose was sure her attractiveness hadn't diminished over the years. Nikki Cardia was born to be a duchess. Perhaps it's a family thing, because for generations they have all girls with powerful feminine powers. That is why it is traditionally the center of power. They are the direct opposite of Estella's family. The girl was distracted by the butler, who asked if something was bothering her. Except the girl didn't think she had a worried look and pushed the butler away. The Duke didn't understand how he could let his emotions show on his face. Suddenly, one of the butlers grabbed the girl's face and said that her eyes were full of misery. Rose wondered if Enoch had always been so empathetic, or if he only acted that way with her. The man asked the girl to reward herself from the cause of her anxiety, and if she couldn't, it was better to destroy her. Rose remembered that such was his position briefly explained in the novel. Enoch had endured incredible pain and suffering before he left the nightmarish magical tower. What had happened had exhausted him and dulled his senses, forcing him to turn to hedonism. The girl knew that Enoch had no family or friends, and perhaps he was obsessed with Yor, for he felt ordinary in her presence. Rose turned to the butler and told him that while he was here, no different from the rest of his servants. If he had any difficulties, let him know. The girl thought about the fact that they both have a life that no one else could have imagined. A few days later, the Duke had already prepared for the banquet. Trying on the suit, he noticed that the sleeves were too long, so he would have to give it to the alteration. He couldn't count how many suits he had tried on. Anna, the maid, asked my lord to try on his shoes, for they had been chosen especially for the banquet. The man's head was already buzzing from what was happening. This did not go unnoticed by the maid, after which she asked whether my lord should bring something. But the man refused and explained that if he ate, he would want to sleep. He asked the maid to better run an errand for him. The man told her that he would like her to pick up the gift he had chosen for the saint. The maid inquired if it was the one he had ordered from Mr. Hugo. The Duke gave an affirmative answer to the maid's question. Anna dressed in casual clothes and promised the Duke that she would be back soon. Rosenta was busy reading a book and noticed that his butler was bored, so he decided that if he had nothing better to do, he could take a walk, except that the butler refused. Rose thought to herself that when they were alone, he could be himself. Suddenly, the girl came across information in a book about the mind curse. A mind curse that affects the mind is very dangerous. If the caster has a weak mind, the curse can affect the caster himself. However, if the caster has exceptional abilities, the level of the curse will increase significantly. This included hypnosis, brainwashing or memory manipulation, seduction, and even hallucinations. The girl wondered why her father hadn't said anything about it. The butler turned to the Duke and informed him that the Duchess had already arrived. Enoch decided to go out and escort them here. The Duke went back to thinking about the curse book and decided that his father probably just hadn't had time to teach him about it. The man realized that Duchess Cardia was an unusual noblewoman. Therefore, he wondered if the butler would be able to handle her. As she approached the window, Rosa realized that she seemed to be worried for nothing. The girl also noticed that the Duchess has not changed much, and so immediately you cannot even say that she is over 40. There were 4 men standing nearby, and Rosa assumed that they were all her husbands. Polygamy was common in Sylvia, and it was said that each ruling generation gathered a harem because the power in the Cardia family belonged to women, and Sylvia was characterized by matriarchy. The Duchess and the Duke drank tea in complete silence. Afterwards, the man decided to lighten the mood and approached the Duchess of Cardia to ask what had brought her here. The woman said that she wanted to see him for once before the banquet and see how he had grown up and what kind of duke he had become. Rose realized that the Duchess had come all this way to see him. Afterward, the Duke asked the woman what he had grown up to be. The Duchess confessed that he looked like Jane. Rose realized that it had been a long time since she had heard her mother's name, which sounded like Jane Veronica. It was a real relief for the Duchess to know that he hadn't followed in the footsteps of that scoundrel Caligo. It was strange for Rosa to hear, since usually everyone said she and he looked almost identical. Even on their first meeting, Rosa had thought of them looking alike. The girl noticed that the Duchess's voice became more gentle at the mention of her mother. The girl wondered how the Duchess knew about her mother. The Duchess told her that Jane had worked as her maid before she was here. She was a beautiful girl, and they had been friends since they were young. The man had fallen in love with that creep. Rose was confused when she learned that her mother had served the Duchess. The Duchess realized that Rosenta, unlike her, knew that many generations of the Estella family had worked in the trade industry. Except that Rosa did not know this. It seemed to her that they were only slightly connected to the trade. The Duchess told her that when she was still an heiress, Caligo had visited Sylvia. And that was when the trouble happened. For Jane had fallen in love with him. The Duchess understood that love doesn't need a reason. Rosenta could not disagree with this, because every time his mother spoke, she looked like a little girl, and nothing could make her fall out of love with him, and he did not want to condemn his mother's choice. The Duke wondered what kind of goods his family had wanted from them for generations. At that very second, the Duchess's mood changed. She became very angry that her father had not told him anything at all. After that, it became clear to the woman why Rosenta never came to Sylvia and never approached them. Duchess Cardia said that Caligo had personally visited Sylvia a couple years ago as well. The Duke recalled that in his memory, his father had indeed been absent a couple times while visiting Sylvia. The Duchess had said that as far as Rosenta knew, they had the resources and ability to grow different types of plants, and each time, Caligo had come for the plant. It became clear to the man that this was a plant of some special kind that others were not supposed to know about. Rosenta was sure it had something to do with their family's power, and perhaps his father needed it for poison or a curse. Duchess Cardia confirmed those words. The woman understood that no one could predict the day of their death, but she didn't understand how this scoundrel could not take the time to teach it to his only child. The Duchess thought the man was a rotten scumbag. Rosenta asked the Duchess of Cardia if she could tell her what his father had taken from them. The Duchess was only in favor of passing on her knowledge to him. The woman glanced out the window and noticed that the sun was already setting, and so she should get going, for she was beginning to worry about her husbands. Already seated in the carriage, the Duchess reported that she was having fun. Rosenta said he had a great time too, and hoped to meet her again at the banquet. The Duke said he would like to thank the Duchess for cordially answering all of his questions, and if the woman would tell him how many husbands she had, he would send the appropriate number of gifts. The Duchess replied that so far there were not many, only 5. The Duchess noticed that the Duke was also quite choosy, for it took her a moment to realize what a special servant he had. The woman even said that she would like to take him for herself. Rosenta realized that he was about to agree to that condition. However, the Duchess said that judging from the flame in his eyes with which he looks at the others, then the woman believes that she shouldn't desire him, and he has no interest in flowers belonging to others. At this time, everyone was just hanging around the saint, offering either rose oil or wonderful jewelry. The girl was thinking that everything must be prepared perfectly for the coming banquet in her honor. A maid standing nearby informed Saint that she would soon be the new flower of high society. The maid moved closer to the girl's ear and whispered that this was the name given to someone who was the center of attention of high society. The girl also added that this place was now occupied by Vivian Marigold. But the maid assured the saint that everything would change as soon as she showed herself in public. Suddenly, the girl remembered that at the last dinner, Milady had not been in too good a mood. The maids were discussing amongst themselves that she had made a mistake then, and they say His Majesty had hardly said anything and left. Another girl shared that she heard that Vivian was in a fit of rage as she left the dining hall. The girls thought the saint was very kind, but Vivian was the real villain. Many realized that being the Marquis's daughter did not mean that she had good character. The girls were sure that Vivian got this place because she had been persecuting His Majesty since she was a child. That was why the maids thought that she was just lucky to have a family. The saint entered the conversation and said that she didn't think Milady was like that, except that she could be a bit rude sometimes. The high priest entered the room, telling the ladies that it was wrong to gossip. The man asked the girls to refrain from such idle chatter for the sake of the Holy One. The girls immediately began to apologize to the high priest. The man went to the balcony and held out his hand, whereupon a lovely bird perched on his finger. The high priest turned to the saint and said that the wind today was chilly, so she should probably dress warmer. After a while, the girl turned to the saint and said that everything was ready. Yora turned to High Priest Canatel and wondered what he thought of her appearance. The girl also hoped that His Majesty would like her as well. The high priest assured the girl that even in plain clothes she would be beautiful to him. The high priest was sure that the saint was adored by everyone. At this time, the Duke finally finished reading the book. It took a long time because he was learning as he read. Therefore, Rosenta decided to conduct an experiment. The man directed his magic towards the skeleton, after which it began to move. But after a while, the Duke's nose began to bleed. The man decided that it was probably too early to use this ability. He tried it for the first time, and immediately there was a problem. Assumed it was most likely due to a blocker in the magic. His father had told his son that his powers would get out of control, so he had worn blockers since he was a child, but who knew they would only hinder him in the future. The man hoped that would change with time, but considering how long he'd been wearing them, it would likely take just as much more time and effort to reverse the effects. Rosenta noticed that it was already morning and remembered that today was the day. Walking out of his office, the Duke immediately ran into the butler who had come to escort him. While she was brushing my lord's hair, he inquired of the maid if she had taken the thing he had asked for. The girl replied that it was now in the dresser and inquired whether it was worth fetching, to which the Duke answered in the affirmative. From behind, a butler approached the Duke and inquired what it was for, to which Rosenta told him that it was a gift, and it was quite expensive. The material the veil is woven from makes the face hard to see thanks to light-type magic. The butler leaned closer to the Duke and wondered if it was for him. The Duke repeated that it was a gift. After a while, the Duke told Anne to tell the coachman to get ready to leave. The girl agreed and asked the Duke if he needed a chaperone, to which she received a negative answer. Rosenta thought about the fact that he needed to see Theodore before the banquet began, so they didn't need anyone else's ears. The Duke glanced at the butler, who made a pitying look, and then inquired what he should do. Rosenta repeated that he had no intention of taking anyone with him. The Duke decided that he had enough to pay attention to Enoch and needed to focus on himself. But it wasn't that simple. As the Duke was fixing his hair, the butler came up behind him and started fixing it too, thus surprising Rosenta. The Duke said that everyone at the banquet would look at him and someone would get his gift, and Enoch would just have to be around to be happy. Upon arrival, Duke Estella was presented with a letter from His Majesty. Theodore wrote on a piece of paper for Rosenta to come to that place. The man immediately thought that there was a forest on the palace grounds, with a shrine in the corner and a small clearing surrounded by trees behind it. Rosenta used to hide there often when he visited the palace as a child. The Duke came to where His Majesty said to go, and came across him there just like that. The Duke looked at his friend and realized that Theodore was in a terrible state. The man began to worry that something had happened in the days since the saint had appeared. Theodore decided to tell his friend directly that just a little more, and he wouldn't be able to stand it. He tried very hard to figure it out on his own, but failed miserably. Rosenta remembered that Theodore had always been optimistic, cheerful, and graceful. But now Rosenta could clearly feel Theodore crumbling inside, and it was as if he could hear that silent scream. The Duke steps closer and encloses his friend in a bear hug. Eventually, after some time, Theodore confessed that he can't control his own body when he is near the saint. The man added that at first he thought he had feelings for her, but decided that was definitely not the case. Theodore didn't know what the reason was, but he had this unpleasant feeling inside, as if he was being tamed like a puppy. His Majesty decided that was the best possible explanation. It was incomprehensible to Rosenta, but the others feel or see something strange when they are around Yora. The man was immediately reminded of his friend's words about Saint being a hypocrite, and Theodore feeling like a tame puppy around her. The Duke decided that he must have been too preoccupied with the original plot and failed to notice the forest behind the trees. The Duke was brought out of his musings by Theodore's voice. The man assured that he was telling the truth, and he was not interested in the saint at all, because her stay here is useful only in that it improves the reputation of the empire, and personally him. That was why Theodore said that it would be good if she stayed. His Highness realized that their state had never had its own religion. Rosenta reflected on the fact that, unlike Roman, Theodore didn't develop feelings for the saint here, but rather, his fief had grown closer. Despite the fact that they were supposed to not get along, and he pities a minor character, but still stands on the same level with them, the man realized that the novel is a simple book, and in the world, each person affects the course of life. If the past changes, the future will inevitably change. And since they had become different, something might have changed in the saint. Rosenta turned to his friend Theodore and asked him not to worry and let him figure it out for himself. Later, Vivian arrived at the banquet and was incredibly happy to see her friend Rosenta. But when the girl noticed that Theodore was standing next to him, her mood faded in an instant. Still, she had the courage to thank His Majesty for the letter. The girl admitted that she had overdone it a bit that day, and she was sure that the conduct had embarrassed her in the presence of the saint. So the girl asked His Highness to allow her to give him a gift as an apology. The girl held out a beautiful golden bouquet and warned him that if he didn't like it, he could throw it away. Theodore got very excited and didn't understand how such a beautiful bouquet could be thrown away. The man also spoke up about that day and admitted that he couldn't contain his anger and crossed the line, so he apologized to her. After relations between the friends got back on track, they decided to go to the banquet. Theodore informed that he had to enter last, so he asked Rosenta to escort Vivian. After introducing his lordship Duke Rosenta Estella and the esteemed Lady Vivian Marigold, the rest of the nobles present at the banquet immediately began to whisper that there was indeed something between them. Rosenta offered my lady a dance, to which she gladly agreed. After the dance, Vivian informed her friend that she wanted to go join the other girls. The man quietly agreed and decided that they would see each other later. Suddenly, an aristocrat spoke to Duke Estella. The man remarked that the Duke was incredibly handsome as always, and his dancing was quite impressive. The Duke was embarrassed and began to refer that it was all due to the girl's talent. The man realized that the aristocrats were just trying to embarrass him, so he decided to talk to a couple of guests and leave. But what was the Duke's surprise when he saw his butler among the crowd? Rosenta did not understand why he was here, if he was supposed to be in the manor, and even in an expensive suit. The butler immediately saw his Duke and approached him. Rosenta grudgingly asked Enoch why he had come. The butler confessed that he was helping a beautiful lady he had met by chance a couple days ago, and he was her escort. The Duke didn't understand what the bastard was up to, but decided it was nothing, because he could still use his help. Rosenta decided that the butler's plan had succeeded since they had met. Suddenly, the Duke said he wanted to ask Enoch something. Rosenta noticed that Enoch never ceased to amaze, so it would be good to answer him in the same way. Just as suddenly, Saint Han-Yora and the High Priest Canatel began to be greeted. The Duke asked the butler to keep an eye on the saint all evening. Rosenta searched for the Duchess with his gaze and eventually found her successfully, after which he approached to keep her company. In response, the woman asked the Duke how he was doing. He replied that thanks to the Duchess, the time had been informative. The woman was glad to hear that. She then took out a piece of paper from her miniature purse, neatly folded into an envelope. Rosenta assumed that the note held the key to everything his father had gotten from Sylvia. The man noticed that Saint Han-Yora looked quite happy, and she was also engrossed in the conversation. The Duke immediately began to look for his butler, for he must be somewhere nearby. Eventually, the man did indeed find Enoch watching the saint closely. The Duke also noticed that the butler was holding a glass of wine. Rosenta hoped that Enoch would not become intoxicated. Suddenly, Duke Grey approached Duke Estella, informing him that it had been a long time since they had seen each other. Duke Grey explained that he was up to his ears in business as usual, tending to Terjan. The men were chatting amongst themselves when suddenly another aristocrat with platinum hair headed in their direction. Rosenta studied the snow-white hair, the misty gray eyes as if covered with ashes, and it was immediately clear to him who stood before him. After that, the Duke said that he was glad to meet Duke Elif Snow. In response, the man shook his hand. Rosenta noticed that the Duke was very cold, just like the north he ruled. North Glacus was home to snow wolves in ancient times, and now it is home to new species of animals. And snow wolves of mixed ancestry died when the harsh cold and blizzard cut them off from the outside world, after which the duchy began to keep to itself. Rosenta was glad that they were finally lucky enough to meet all the dukes. In the end, an awkward silence hung between the three. Duke Grey decided to defuse the situation and turned to Rosenta to inquire if he had had a chance to speak with the saint. Duke Estella unemotionally told him that they had crossed paths. Duke Grey hoped then that he could introduce them. Rosenta didn't understand what this hyena was up to. Afterwards, he asked Duke Grey to forgive him. After all, he and the saint weren't close enough, so Rosenta was sure Duke Grey could handle it himself. It wasn't necessary to ask him to do so. But Duke Grey explained that it is easier to get close to a person when there is a mediator between them. That way you can go straight to a conversation. Rosenta didn't understand why he would change his plans for his pleasure. Suddenly, Duke Snow entered the conversation, saying that it seemed they were too late, for the saint had already left. Meanwhile, Enoch was talking sweetly to the girls. One of them said she had heard that he had come as Lady Margaret's partner, whereupon she inquired how they had met. Enoch told her that they had met in a cafe while drinking tea. Lady Margaret had given him, a stranger from the village, a great opportunity, so she is simply an amazing girl. Except that if Enoch had known then that she would fall in love with him the first moment she saw him, he wouldn't have worked so hard with seduction magic. During the breaks between chatter, the butler glanced at the saint and the high priest standing beside her. Enoch informed the lovely ladies that he should excommunicate. The girls were surprised to hear this, but accepted the fact nonetheless, for surely he must have something serious going on. One of the girls suggested that Enoch go out together for some fresh air. The man lost his temper and reminded the girls that he had just apologized in order to leave. At that very second, the ladies became uncomfortable. The butler went in search of the saint as he suddenly came across her sitting near the fountain. Because she had been wearing uncomfortable shoes at the banquet, her feet were aching. The saint admitted that it was unseemly to take off her shoes, but explained that her feet were very sore. Then she asked him if he would mind if she went shoeless for a while. The girl introduced herself by her name, Han Yora, and asked the stranger what his name was. At this time, the man reflected that he too had a name, not a number, a nickname like the son of a harlot, but a real name. But he wished to be pronounced by the lips of only one person. The girl laughed when she saw the man smile, and said that in the books her friends had given her, it was customary to choose a name herself in such situations. Han Yora took a closer look at the stranger, and noticed that their hair color was very similar, and it was the first time she had seen such a thing here. Granted, the man thought it was a coincidence, but she wished she could give the nameless man a name like they do in novels. Except the butler didn't like that prospect too much. The man didn't understand why, when their gazes crossed, he got a headache. Han Yora pondered and told the man that the name Adrian suited him, whereupon the girl decided she would call him that. At that very second, Enoch felt a throbbing thumping in his head. The saint kept going on and on about how she needed to address him somehow, so the girl asked the man to consider it just an alias. Enoch pondered the fact that he already had a name to prove his existence, but when he heard the name Adrian, rage began to overwhelm him. Now it was clear to the man why the Duke had asked to keep an eye on her. The butler felt as if someone was forcibly awakening emotions in him, and he was about to vomit. Enoch consciously resisted it, but if he accepted it, he would feel worse. After killing his mentor, Enoch was left with one of his books. Recently, after a long time, he opened it to study spells that might come in handy at the banquet. The man had read that the mind-affecting magic he had used on that girl made one experience almost the same feelings that had descended upon him now. But there was no trace of magic here. Suddenly, the saint grabbed the man's arm, calling him Adrian again, and wondered if he should call for someone. Enoch hurriedly snatched his hand away and told the girl to be quiet now. Enoch lost his temper and ordered the girl not to call him by that name, for he already had a great name, Enoch. The man warned the saint that if they continued like this, it would be no fun. After which he left the girl. Enoch was incredibly angry and realized that this girl had a talent for pissing others off enough to want to kill her. At the banquet, they had already announced that His Majesty the Emperor had arrived. His Highness informed the aristocrats that they could raise their heads. The Emperor looked for the saint with his eyes, then asked the high priest where she had gone. Canatel told him that the saint had gone out for a short time, but that she would be back soon. The Emperor decided that while the saint had withdrawn, he would introduce her later when she returned. But until then, His Majesty hoped the guests would enjoy the banquet. Rosenta realized that the desire to leave this chaos was only growing. Suddenly, someone called out to him again. It was once again Duke Gray, who asked Rosenta how about gathering all the dukes for dinner at the manor. Duke Gray revealed that he had already spoken to Duchess Cardia. Rosenta realized that dinner with the dukes sounded good, so he decided to accept the invitation. Duke Gray was pleased by this, so he suggested that they see each other tomorrow. Left alone, Rosenta thought about what could be even more relaxing than just not talking to anyone. Just as suddenly, the man noticed that everyone was suddenly silent, all because the high priest began to introduce the Saint Han Yoru. At that very second, all the aristocrats clapped for the girl. The saint hesitantly greeted the guests, saying that she was the daughter of the goddess Luz, named Han Yora. The girl promised that she would work very hard so that everyone could find peace with the blessing of the goddess of light. Everyone immediately began to applaud the girl, but only no one noticed how much her hands were trembling at that moment. Rosenta went to the balcony and turned to his butler Enoch, who was in the body of a crow. Rosenta immediately realized that something was wrong. The Duke noticed that after meeting with the saint, the butler's gaze became murderous, and the Duke was frightened by it. As a result, the man decided to ask the butler directly what was wrong. Enoch told him that it had been a long time, but he was ready to be forgotten. The butler insisted that the Duke call him by name, whereupon Rosenta complied with his request. The man couldn't understand what it was that Enoch could say that made Enoch shiver so much. Rosenta asked directly to tell Enoch what had happened, but they were interrupted by Theodore, who had just arrived. His Highness wondered what they were talking about. Rosenta turned to his friend and asked what had brought him here, for he should be with the guests now. Theodore suspected something and asked why he couldn't be here now. Theodore admitted to Rosenta that he had followed him when he saw him going to the terrace, but the Emperor was far more concerned about what Enoch had forgotten here. Theodore clearly remembered the last time his friend had said that they would not cross paths again. Rosenta could not object, for he had not even supposed that Theodore would remember that. Enoch entered the conversation and asked his duke why he said they would not meet again. But the thing was that time, there was nothing to suggest that they would meet again. Rosenta had no idea that Enoch seemed so obsessive and that such a situation would happen. Rosenta immediately shoved Enoch away from him and told him to stop screwing around. Rosenta didn't understand how he could act like this in front of Theodore, who disliked him so much and even read defiance in his gaze. Theodore noted with annoyance that they both seemed to be very friendly. Rosenta explained that it could not be otherwise since he was his servant.